I was grading third-grade math papers when my phone buzzed with a message to the family group chat. My mother had sent out the Christmas dinner invitation to everyone but me. Her follow-up message was a dagger. She wrote that all her children were successful except me, that I chose to be a lowly teacher, and she no longer saw me as her daughter. I did not text back a tearful apology. I did not block her. Instead, I grabbed my keys, drove straight to their holiday feast, and delivered a Christmas present that would financially ruin them. My name is Sophie. I am 33 years old, and for most of my adult life, I was the financial anchor for a family that treated me like garbage. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who underestimated your worth. Trust me, you will want to stick around to hear how a lowly teacher flipped the script on their entire wealthy facade. Growing up in a wealthy Chicago suburb image was everything to my parents, Brenda and Thomas. They leased luxury cars they could barely afford and joined expensive country clubs just to rub elbows with the local elite. They were obsessed with status. While my younger sister Amanda was pampered, bought designer clothes, and groomed to marry into money, I was the pragmatic one. I chose education. I loved teaching children and watching them grow. But to my parents, having a public school teacher for a daughter was a severe social embarrassment. They hid my profession from their friends. Despite their constant disdain for my career, they had absolutely no problem using my pristine credit score. 5 years ago, Thomas made a disastrous business investment. They faced immediate foreclosure on their sprawling 5-bedroom estate. Desperate, they begged me to co-sign their refinancing mortgage. Like a dutiful, desperate daughter craving her parents' love, I did it. I bound myself to their massive debt, silently hoping it would finally earn me their respect. I could not have been more wrong. It was Christmas Eve. I was sitting at my small kitchen table in my modest apartment, a red grading pen in my hand, staring at the family group chat on my phone. The message from Brenda was crystal clear and deliberately cruel. It read, "We are having a lovely dinner tonight at 8. Amanda and Trey are bringing the vintage wine. Sophie, please do not come. I cannot have Trey and his senior partners knowing my eldest daughter is just a poorly paid teacher. It is a complete embarrassment to this family. Consider yourself disowned. Merry Christmas." My chest tightened, not from sorrow, but from a sudden, sharp, and overwhelming clarity. For 5 long years, I had quietly paid the extra property taxes they could not afford. I had sacrificed my own savings and lived incredibly frugally just to keep a roof over their heads. And this was my grand reward. Being formally uninvited to a house that I was legally keeping afloat. I put down my red pen. I did not cry a single tear. I went to my home office filing cabinet, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and walked out to my car. The snow was falling heavily as I drove across town, my mind racing with a newfound sense of cold determination. When I pulled into their massive circular driveway, the house was blazing with warm, golden lights. Through the massive bay windows, I could see them laughing and drinking. The grand dining table was set with fine china crystal glasses and expensive silver. I walked up the icy front steps and pushed the heavy oak door open. It was unlocked just as it always was for their guests. The door shut behind me with a loud thud, instantly cutting off the festive holiday jazz music playing smoothly in the foyer. The laughter in the dining room stopped abruptly. Brenda dropped her crystal wine glass onto the expensive Persian rug. It shattered instantly, spilling dark red wine like blood across the intricate woven patterns. Thomas stood up quickly, his face flushing with immediate anger and embarrassment. Amanda, sitting comfortably next to her husband, rolled her eyes in dramatic disgust. Trey, a 34-year-old African-American hedge fund manager who had always looked down his nose at my profession, leaned back in his velvet dining chair. He looked me up and down, his gaze stopping with intense judgment on my slightly worn practical winter coat. Trey smirked and adjusted his expensive silk tie. "Are you lost, Sophie? The soup kitchen is 3 blocks down the road. Or did your pathetic teacher's salary run out before the end of the month again? Are you here to beg for leftovers?" Amanda laughed, a high-pitched grating sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Honestly, Sophie, you are completely ruining the aesthetic of our evening. Mom explicitly told you not to come. You are embarrassing us in front of Trey and you look homeless. Brenda finally found her voice, her face twisted in pure disgust. I told you I do not see you as a daughter anymore. Get out of my elegant house before I call the police. You do not belong here with us. You chose to be a nobody in life. I walked slowly into the dining room, my wet winter boots deliberately leaving dark, slushy tracks on their pristine, polished hardwood floor. I did not yell. I did not show a single ounce of the pain I used to feel for these people. I stopped right at the head of the table where my father was standing. I looked calmly at Thomas, then at Brenda, and finally at Trey, whose arrogant, punchable smirk was permanently glued to his face. "This is not just your elegant house, Mom," I said smoothly, keeping my voice dangerously low. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the thick manila envelope. I tossed it effortlessly onto the center of the dining table. It landed heavily right next to the massive roasted turkey platter, knocking over a silver candlestick. Thomas looked at the envelope, visibly confused. "What is this garbage?" he demanded, pointing a shaking finger at me. "That is a formal legal notice," I replied, making sure my voice carried clearly over the silence of the room. I spent the last 3 months working extensively with my attorney and your mortgage lender. Since I have been the one paying the massive property taxes you repeatedly defaulted on, and since my name is heavily tied to the deed and the mortgage, as your primary co-signer, I had the legal leverage to force a complete financial restructuring. I just officially removed myself as the financial guarantor and co-signer on this house. The entire room went completely suffocatingly silent. Thomas turned pale white, looking like he might pass out. He worked in finance long enough to know exactly what that meant. Without my pristine credit score and my incredibly consistent debt-to-income ratio, artificially propping them up, the bank was legally required to reassess their risky loan. I smiled sweetly at my terrified father. "The bank will be sending you a formal certified letter next week. Without my excellent credit backing your reckless spending, your mortgage interest rate is going to skyrocket to a subprime penalty rate. Your monthly payment is about to triple overnight. I hope Trey's big hedge fund bonus is as large as his ego, because you are going to need every single penny of it to pay your new mortgage, or they will foreclose on you in 90 days. Amanda gasped loudly, her face completely draining of color. "You cannot do that to us. That is pure financial sabotage, you jealous witch." "No, Amanda," I said, turning on my heel toward the front door without a single ounce of regret. "It is called finally taking out the trash. Enjoy your expensive vintage wine, and Merry Christmas to you all." I walked out the front door, the freezing cold winter air hitting my face, and for the absolute first time in my entire adult life, I felt completely and utterly free. I drove away into the snowy night, leaving them to their shattered crystal, their cold turkey, and their looming, inescapable financial ruin. But that was only the very beginning of my journey. I walked away that night as a scorned teacher, but 3 years later, our paths would violently cross again in a way absolutely none of them could have ever predicted. For 3 years, I did not hear a single word from my family, which was the greatest gift they could have ever given me. Freed from the suffocating financial burden of their mortgage and the constant emotional drain of their narcissism, I poured every ounce of my energy into a passion project I had been quietly developing for years. As a teacher, I saw firsthand where early childhood education was failing, so I coded an interactive learning app in my tiny apartment. I called it Scholar Steps. What started as a small tool for my classroom exploded overnight. Within 2 years, millions of students were using it. By the third year, a massive Silicon Valley tech conglomerate bought the app for $45 million in cash. I went from a struggling public school teacher to a secret multi-million-dollar tech founder. But I had no desire to buy flashy sports cars or designer handbags to prove my worth. Instead, I invested my wealth into something that actually mattered. When I heard that the historic Chicago Athenaeum, a breathtaking private library downtown with towering marble columns and priceless first editions, was on the brink of bankruptcy and about to be sold to condo developers, I swooped in. Through my private LLC, I bought the entire building outright. I owned the land, the books, the legacy. I kept my ownership strictly anonymous. The library staff simply knew me as the new director, who preferred to work hands-on rather than sit in an ivory tower. I loved walking the quiet aisles, organizing collections, and breathing in the scent of old paper and polished mahogany. It was a peaceful Tuesday afternoon. The library was closed to the general public for a private inventory check. I was wearing a simple beige cashmere sweater, dark jeans, and comfortable flats, carrying a heavy stack of leather-bound archival records across the grand reading room. The heavy brass doors swung open completely, ignoring the closed sign hanging clearly in the window. Footsteps echoed sharply against the marble floor. A loud booming voice shattered the serene silence of my sanctuary. "I need the main hall, the terrace, and top-tier catering." Trey was barking into his cell phone, his voice dripping with his usual obnoxious arrogance. "Richard is flying in from the New York office, and if this anniversary party does not scream old money, my promotion to senior partner is completely dead. Make it happen." He snapped his phone shut. Amanda walked in right beside him, her heels clicking loudly. She was holding a tiny designer bag and wearing a fur coat that looked completely ridiculous for a mild October afternoon. They stood in the center of the grand foyer, looking around at the sweeping mahogany staircases and gold leaf ceilings like they were shopping for a new toy. I stopped in my tracks, the heavy books pressing against my chest. My heart gave a brief, involuntary jolt, but it was quickly replaced by a wave of cold amusement. 3 years had not humbled them. If anything, they looked even more desperate to project an image of wealth they likely did not possess. I stood quietly in the shadows of a towering bookshelf watching them. "Where is the staff in this dusty place?" Amanda complained loudly, fanning herself. "I told you we should have just booked the Ritz, Trey. This place smells like old people." Trey adjusted his custom-tailored suit. "The Ritz is too common, Amanda. The Athenaeum is exclusive. The partners love this historical nonsense. It proves we have culture." Just then, Trey turned his head and spotted me standing at the end of the aisle with my stack of books. He did not recognize me at first. To him, I was just a piece of the furniture, a lowly worker in comfortable shoes. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers at me loudly, exactly the way one might call a disobedient dog. "Hey, you!" he shouted across the reading room. "Put the books down and get over here. I need to speak to whoever is in charge of renting out this space." I slowly walked out from the shadows into the warm light pouring through the stained glass windows. As I stepped closer, Amanda's annoyed expression suddenly froze. Her jaw dropped slightly, and her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock behind her oversized designer sunglasses. "Sophie," she gasped, taking a step back, as if she had just seen a ghost. Trey blinked, his arrogant scowl morphing into a look of absolute disdain. He looked me up and down, taking in my plain clothes and the heavy books in my arms. A cruel, familiar smirk spread across his face. "Well, well, well," Trey chuckled, shaking his head. "If it is not the prodigal sister, I see you finally moved up in the world. From public school teacher to minimum wage librarian. Did the school district finally fire you for being too depressing?" Amanda quickly recovered from her shock, her signature condescending sneer returning to her perfectly contoured face. "Honestly, Sophie," she sighed dramatically, "you are hauling dusty books around like a common laborer. It is actually pathetic. I thought you would have at least found a husband to support you by now. But I guess some things never change." I looked at them, letting their insults wash over me without a single flinch. They had no idea they were standing in my building insulting the sole owner of the ground beneath their feet. The irony was so delicious I could practically taste it. "Can I help you two?" I asked evenly, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "We do not need your help, sweetheart," Trey said, stepping forward and invading my personal space. "We are here to book this venue for our 5th wedding anniversary gala. It is going to be the social event of the season, Hundreds of elite guests. A budget you could not comprehend in your wildest dreams. So be a good little librarian, run along and fetch me the real manager. I need someone with actual authority. I stared at Trey's polished dress shoes, then up to his arrogant eyes. A brilliant, wicked idea sparked in my mind. If they wanted to play a game of status, I was more than happy to deal the cards. I set my stack of rare books down on a nearby mahogany table. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a blank guest badge. I grabbed a pen, quickly scribbled event coordinator on it, and clipped it to my sweater. I gave them my best, most customer service-oriented smile. "You are looking at her," I lied smoothly. "I am the senior event coordinator for the Chicago Athenaeum. If you want to book this venue, you have to go through me." Amanda let out a sharp, theatrical laugh that echoed through the grand reading room. "Event coordinator," she repeated, wiping a fake tear from her eye. "So basically, you went from babysitting third graders to planning parties. Wow, Sophie, you are really climbing that corporate ladder." Trey smirked, adjusting his heavy gold watch. "Hey, do not knock it, Amanda. Somebody has to arrange the chairs and fold the napkins. It might as well be your sister." I kept my fake customer service smile plastered securely on my face. "If you will follow me to the booking office," I said, gesturing toward the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall, "we can discuss our available packages." I led them into a luxurious mahogany-paneled office that actually belonged to me, though they assumed it was just a staff room. I sat behind the massive antique desk and gestured for them to take the two leather guest chairs opposite me. Amanda did not even bother to sit. She immediately began pacing the room, listing her demands like a dictator reading a manifesto. She wanted imported white orchids cascading from the second-floor balconies. She wanted a live string quartet playing contemporary pop songs during the cocktail hour. She wanted a 5-course tasting menu featuring white truffles, Wagyu beef, and beluga caviar. She demanded that the waitstaff wear white gloves and tuxedo tails. I typed away on my computer, pretending to calculate the exhaustive costs, while actually just opening a blank document. "The Athenaeum offers 3 tiers for private events," I explained evenly. "The silver, the gold, and the platinum. Based on your highly specific and extensive list of requirements, you are looking exclusively at the platinum tier." Amanda leaned forward, placing her expensive designer bag directly on my desk. "Then we will take the platinum. Do not worry about the price, Sophie. My husband can actually afford it, unlike your ex-colleagues at the public school who probably have to budget for a cup of cheap diner coffee. We want the absolute best of the best. I need Richard Trey's boss to walk in here and feel completely intimidated by our level of wealth." Trey puffed out his chest, leaning back in the leather chair. "Exactly. Richard is flying in from the New York office. If this party goes off without a single hitch, that senior partner position is practically mine. So write up the contract, Sophie, and make sure there are no hidden fees or amateur mistakes. I read complex financial contracts for a living, so do not try to pull a fast one on me just because you need the commission." I hit print on my computer and waited as the heavy machinery hummed in the corner. I slid the crisp, freshly printed contract across the polished wood desk. "The platinum package for 300 guests, including full exclusive access to the main hall, the outdoor terrace, premium catering, and top-tier floral arrangements, comes to exactly $100,000, plus a non-refundable $20,000 deposit due today to secure the date." Amanda choked slightly on her breath, her eyes darting frantically to Trey. "100,000, she whispered, her arrogant facade slipping for a fraction of a second. Trey swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his custom silk tie. For a brief, glorious moment, I saw genuine panic flash in his eyes. I knew for a factual certainty his hedge fund base salary was not enough to casually drop 6 figures on a single night, especially with the absurd lifestyle and luxury car leases they maintained. But Trey was a creature of pure, fragile ego, and the absolute last thing he was going to do was admit he could not afford it in front of the sister-in-law he had just spent the last 10 minutes humiliating. Trey quickly masked his panic with a loud, dismissive scoff. 100,000. That is pocket change for a guy like me. Where do I sign? I handed him a sleek silver pen from my desk organizer. Standard policy requires a valid credit card on file for the deposit, and the primary sponsor's signature guaranteeing the full amount. Furthermore, if you are using a corporate account, our insurance policy strictly mandates the signature of a senior company officer as a secondary guarantor. Trey pulled a heavy black metal credit card from his designer wallet and tossed it arrogantly onto the desk. It was a corporate expense card issued by his firm. A card meant strictly for client entertainment and approved business expenses, not personal vanity anniversary parties. "I will sign as the primary," Trey said, clicking the pen. He quickly scrawled his name on the bottom line. Then, without missing a single beat, he moved his hand to the secondary guarantor line. "And I will just sign for Richard since he already approved my entertainment budget for this quarter." My eyes locked onto his hand as he expertly forged his boss's signature right before my eyes. Richard Dalton. He did not hesitate. He did not pause to think about the consequences. He signed his boss's name with the fluid, practiced precision of a man who had definitely committed this exact crime before. He was using stolen company funds to finance his wife's extravagant party, actively committing serious corporate fraud to maintain a pathetic illusion of extreme wealth. Trey slid the contract back across the desk, looking incredibly smug. "There you go, sweetheart. $100,000 fully guaranteed. Try not to lose it." I know handling important paperwork can be overwhelming for former public school teachers. I looked down at the forged signature, a slow, icy wave of triumph washing over my entire body. I had him. I had the golden child's perfect husband dead to rights on a felony charge. I picked up the heavy black credit card, ran it through my terminal to process the $20,000 deposit, and handed it back to him along with his printed receipt. "Your deposit has cleared successfully," I said, making sure my voice remained completely steady and professional. I took the original signed contract, opened the heavy steel safe bolted beneath my desk, and placed the highly incriminating document securely inside. I locked it with a satisfying heavy click. "The Athenaeum is officially yours for the evening of the 25th. Amanda stood up, smoothing down her designer skirt, with a triumphant, malicious smile. "See that you do not mess this up, Sophie. I want everything absolutely perfect down to the last detail. If the champagne is even slightly warm, I will personally make sure you are fired from this little side gig and out on the street." "You have my absolute word, Amanda," I replied, looking directly into her cold eyes with a bright smile. "This party will be a night you and Trey will never, ever forget." They turned and walked out of my office, their loud laughter echoing down the mahogany hallway as they celebrated their grand display of fake wealth. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the loaded weapon I needed to destroy their entire fraudulent lives. The trap was set, the ink was dry, and all I had to do now was wait for them to walk right into the slaughterhouse. The very next afternoon, the heavy mahogany doors of the library swung open once again. I was standing near the grand staircase finalizing a floral arrangement order on my tablet when I heard the unmistakable shrill voice of my mother echoing through the quiet halls. Amanda had apparently wasted absolutely no time bringing our parents down to the Athenaeum to show off the extravagant venue she had secured. I watched quietly from the steps as Brenda and Thomas walked into the grand foyer. My mother was draped in a fake Chanel tweed jacket, her eyes darting around the magnificent architecture with greedy approval. My father, Thomas, wore his usual pristine golf polo, his chest puffed out as if he personally owned the historic building just by standing inside it. Amanda was leading the charge, pointing excitedly toward the vaulted ceilings and the massive crystal chandeliers. Trey trailed slightly behind them, looking uncharacteristically nervous. He kept checking his phone, likely sweating over the massive fraudulent charge he had just put on his corporate card the day before. Then Brenda turned her head and spotted me standing by the staircase. Her impressed smile instantly vanished, replaced by a deep, familiar scowl of intense disapproval. She marched directly over to me, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Sophie," Brenda snapped, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "What on earth are you doing here? Amanda told me she booked this magnificent place, but she conveniently left out the part where my eldest daughter is working as glorified hired help. I thought you were a teacher." Did you finally realize how pathetic that paycheck was and get a second job serving people? Amanda laughed from a few feet away, linking her arm through Trey's. I told you, Mom. She is the event coordinator. Basically, she is the one who has to make sure my champagne glass is never empty on the night of the gala. It is quite fitting, really. I maintained my calm professional posture, refusing to let their toxic bait drag me into an emotional reaction. It is a private event space, Brenda, I said evenly. I handle the logistics. I see Amanda brought you down for a tour. Thomas stepped forward, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked around the opulent space, then looked back at me with a sudden calculating gleam in his eye. Well, since you are the one handling the logistics, we need to have a serious conversation about the final bill. Amanda told me this platinum package costs $100,000. Trey generously put down the $20,000 deposit yesterday, but paying the remaining $80,000 is completely ridiculous for a single night. Brenda nodded aggressively in agreement, stepping so close to me I could smell her overpowering expensive perfume. Exactly. You work here, Sophie, so you obviously have an employee discount. I expect you to apply it immediately and waive the remaining venue fees. It is the absolute least you can do for your sister. Family helps family, and considering how much money we spent raising you, you owe us this favor. I looked at my mother, entirely unfazed by her delusional demands. I do not have the authority to waive $80,000 in corporate fees, Brenda. The contract Trey signed yesterday is legally binding. The remaining balance must be paid in full prior to the event or the gala is officially canceled. Thomas's face turned a violent shade of red. He slammed his hand down on a nearby wooden display table, causing a stack of vintage books to rattle. How dare you speak to your mother that way? He shouted, his voice echoing loudly through the reading room. You are an ungrateful, selfish brat. We gave you life. We put a roof over your head. You ruined our mortgage 3 years ago with your petty little stunt, and now you are trying to extort your own sister. Just go into the computer and override the system. No one is going to notice. I cannot steal from my employer. Thomas, I replied, my voice dangerously quiet but firm. Corporate policy is incredibly strict. If the $80,000 is not secured today, the date goes back on the open market. Amanda gasped, turning frantically to her husband. Trey, do something. You cannot let her cancel my party. All the invitations have already gone out to the senior partners at your firm. If we cancel now, we will be the laughingstock of Chicago. Trey looked like he was about to physically be sick. His arrogant swagger was completely gone. He pulled at his collar, avoiding my eyes. Listen, Sophie, he stammered, trying to sound authoritative, but failing miserably. I have significant assets tied up in offshore investments right now. I cannot liquidate $80,000 in cash by this afternoon. Can we just delay the final billing until the morning after the event? I am good for it. I knew exactly why he was panicking. He had already committed corporate fraud for the deposit. If he tried to run another $80,000 on that company card, the hedge fund's accounting department would freeze the account instantly and call the police. He was trapped, and he was terrified. I tapped my tablet thoughtfully, pretending to consider his request. The Athenaeum policy strictly prohibits post-event billing unless the client provides physical collateral of equal or greater value. Without a certified asset guarantee, my hands are completely tied. Thomas, completely unable to stand watching his wealthy son-in-law look weak, suddenly stepped right into the middle of the circle. He puffed his chest out to its absolute maximum capacity, playing the role of the grand patriarch swooping in to save the day. This is absolutely ridiculous, Thomas spat, glaring at me. If your pathetic company does not trust a prominent hedge fund manager, they can certainly trust a prominent real estate owner. I am a man of considerable means. If it gets this stupid remaining balance off Trey's back so he can focus on his promotion, I will personally guarantee the $80,000. Trey looked at Thomas with wide, desperate eyes. Thomas, you do not have to do that. Nonsense, Thomas boomed, waving his hand dismissively. We take care of our own, Trey. Unlike some people in this room, he shot a venomous glare in my direction. What kind of collateral do you need, Sophie? I smiled a genuine, terrifying smile that they completely misinterpreted as submission. A real estate deed would suffice, I said smoothly. If you put up the deed to your colonial house as a physical guarantee, I can draft a legal addendum delaying the final payment until the morning after the event. Fine, Thomas barked. Draft the paperwork. I will bring the original deed down here within the hour. You are such a good father, Thomas. Brenda cooed, glaring at me. See, Sophie, that is what real family looks like. I nodded slowly, my heart singing a dark, victorious melody. I turned and walked back toward my office to print the legal addendum. Thomas was recklessly tying his only remaining asset to Trey's fraudulent debt, entirely blind to the catastrophic danger he was in. He had no idea that I had already spent the last month quietly tracking his financial records. I knew his house was severely underwater. I knew he had not paid his property taxes in over 2 years. And most importantly, he had absolutely no idea that by handing me that deed, he was willingly giving me the exact weapon I needed to render them all completely homeless. I happily drafted the paperwork, eager to seal their absolute destruction. 2 days later, the grand terrace of the Chicago Athenaeum was completely transformed into a private sunlit dining space for the Platinum Catering tasting. The exclusive culinary team I had contracted had set up an immaculate display of the 5-course menu Amanda had so aggressively demanded. Crystal glasses sparkled under the afternoon sun, and the air was thick with the rich scent of roasted Wagyu beef and white truffles. I stood quietly near the entrance, holding my clipboard and playing my role as the dutiful event coordinator to absolute perfection. My family sat around the lavish table, indulging in the expensive food like starving animals pretending to be royalty. Brenda was loudly critiquing the temperature of the soup, trying to sound like a seasoned food critic. Thomas was already on his 3rd glass of imported scotch, his face flushed red as he boasted to one of the waiters about his supposed real estate empire. He was blissfully ignorant of the fact that I now held the legal deed to his crumbling empire safely locked inside my office safe. But my attention was primarily drawn to Amanda and Trey. Amanda was in her element, snapping her fingers at the servers and sending back a perfectly seared scallop because it did not look aesthetically pleasing enough for her social media photos. Trey, however, was a completely different story. The arrogant, chest-puffing hedge fund manager from the booking office was gone. In his place was a pale, sweating, visibly shaking man. He had barely touched his food. He was standing a few feet away from the table, desperately pacing back and forth with his cell phone pressed tightly to his ear. He kept covering his mouth, whispering frantically into the receiver, glancing around with wide, paranoid eyes. I did not need to hear the conversation to know exactly what was happening. The corporate accounting department at his firm had undoubtedly flagged the $100,000 pending charge. The walls were closing in on him rapidly. Amanda noticed me watching them, and her eyes narrowed. She hated that I was standing there calm and composed while she was trying so desperately to prove her superiority. She grabbed a small, delicate porcelain plate from the center of the table. It was piled high with premium beluga caviar, one of the most expensive items on the platinum menu. "Sophie, get over here," Amanda commanded, her voice carrying sharply across the terrace. I walked over to the table, my expression perfectly neutral. "Is there an issue with the menu, Amanda?" She looked at me with a cold, calculating sneer. "The presentation is incredibly sloppy. I told you I wanted perfection, but I guess a former public school teacher does not really understand the concept of luxury. You probably think this is just fancy fish bait." Before I could respond, Amanda deliberately tilted her wrist. The porcelain plate slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor right at my feet. The dark, oily caviar splattered all over my clean beige shoes and the hem of my tailored slacks. Brenda let out a short, cruel laugh, covering her mouth with a linen napkin. Thomas did not even look up from his scotch, completely unfazed by his youngest daughter publicly humiliating his eldest. "Oops," Amanda said, her voice dripping with fake innocence. My hand slipped. "Clean it up, teacher. And do it quickly before the oil stains the marble. I cannot have my guests slipping on your incompetence next week." From the corner of the terrace, a young library staff member named David stepped forward. David was one of my brightest junior archivists, and he knew exactly who I was. He had seen the legal ownership documents when I purchased the building. When he saw Amanda shatter the plate on my shoes, his face flushed with immediate outrage. "Excuse me," David said loudly, stepping between me and Amanda. "You cannot speak to her that way. Ma'am, do you have any idea who you are talking to?" Amanda glared at David, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the edge of the table. "Excuse me," she snapped back. "I am the client paying $100,000 for this venue. I will speak to the hired help however I please. Get me your manager right now." David opened his mouth to drop the absolute bombshell that I was the owner of the entire Athenaeum. But before he could utter a single word, I turned my head and shot him a terrifying deadpan look. I held his gaze for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. I gave him a subtle, sharp shake of my head. The message was clear. Stay quiet. Do not ruin my trap. David swallowed hard, his eyes darting from me to Amanda, before he silently backed away and returned to his station, his fists clenched in quiet frustration. Amanda smirked, clearly believing she had just asserted her dominance over the entire staff. "See? Even your little coworkers know their place. Now get some towels and wipe my mess off your shoes." I did not argue. I did not yell. I simply walked over to the serving station, picked up a pristine white linen napkin, and walked back to the shattered plate. I slowly bent down and began wiping the expensive caviar off my leather shoes. I was not degrading myself. I was securing my victory. I wanted her to feel completely untouchable because the higher she climbed on her pedestal of fake wealth, the harder the concrete was going to feel when I finally ripped it out from under her. As I wiped the dark oil from my shoes, I did not look at Amanda. My eyes were locked entirely on Trey. He was still standing in the corner, his phone pressed to his ear. He had stopped pacing. He was staring directly at me, his face glistening with a cold sweat. He had just watched his wife humiliate the very woman holding a fraudulent contract with his forged signature on it. Through the glass doors of the terrace, I saw him swallow hard, his hands trembling violently. I slowly stood up, tossing the ruined caviar-stained napkin onto Amanda's empty plate. I smoothed down my slacks and offered my sister a bright, perfectly polite smile. "All clean," I said smoothly. "I will ensure the presentation is absolutely flawless for the night of your gala, Amanda. We would not want anything to ruin your perfect evening." I kept my eyes locked on Trey as I said it. He quickly broke eye contact, turning his back to me and frantically whispering into his phone again. He was a drowning man, and the water was rising faster than he could ever possibly swim. The tasting concluded shortly after, with Amanda and Brenda marching out of the library like triumphant queens, entirely unaware that the castle they were parading through was actually a heavily fortified prison, and I held the only key. The morning before the grand gala, the Athenaeum was transformed into a frantic staging ground. The head florist arrived at dawn, hauling dozens of towering white orchid arrangements that Amanda had specifically demanded to drape over the second-floor balconies. The sheer volume of imported flowers was staggering, filling the entire foyer with a heavy, sweet perfume. The vendor immediately requested the final payment of $12,000 for the extravagant display before they would begin the massive installation process. Since Trey had authorized his corporate card to remain on file for all vendor incidentals, I walked over to the main circulation desk and pulled up his account on our payment terminal. I swiped the heavy black metal card. The machine processed for exactly 3 seconds before emitting a sharp beep and flashing a bright red error message across the screen. "Declined. Please contact the issuing bank. Fraud alert lock." I smiled entirely to myself in the empty lobby. The corporate accounting department at his hedge fund had finally frozen the card. The walls were not just closing in on Trey anymore, they were actively crushing him. He was out of time and out of money. I knew Trey was in the building. He had arrived early under the strict pretense of doing a final walkthrough of the audiovisual equipment for his boss's highly anticipated speech. I found him completely alone in a narrow, dimly lit hallway, just behind the rare books archive. He was leaning heavily against the mahogany-paneled wall, his head in his hands, staring blankly at the marble floor. He looked exactly like a man standing on the edge of a very high cliff, feeling the wind threatening to push him over. "Trey," I said calmly, stepping into the quiet hallway. He jumped, visibly startled by the sudden sound of my voice. He quickly stood up straight, frantically smoothing his expensive suit jacket and plastering on his signature mask of arrogant superiority. He wiped a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. "What do you want, Sophie?" He snapped, his voice tight and incredibly defensive. "Can you not see I am busy dealing with actual important business? Go arrange some folding chairs or polish the silverware." "The floral vendor is here," I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "They require the final payment of $12,000 for the imported orchids before they begin the installation on the grand balconies. I just attempted to run the corporate card you left on file for incidentals, but the transaction was immediately declined. The terminal indicated a severe fraud alert lock." Trey's eyes widened in sheer panic. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin looking sickly and ashen in the dim light of the hallway. He swallowed hard, his chest heaving rapidly as he desperately tried to control his accelerating breathing. "That is absolutely impossible," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You probably ran it wrong. You are just a clueless teacher playing dress-up as an event planner. You have absolutely no idea how high-level corporate expense accounts work. There are automatic security protocols for large consecutive purchases. It is a simple fraud protection, hold nothing more." I held up the portable terminal displaying the glaring red error screen directly in his line of sight. "The terminal does not lie, Trey. The corporate account is completely frozen. Unless you have an alternate method of payment ready right now, the florist is going to pack up the orchids and leave the premises. I am sure Amanda will be completely devastated to find her platinum tier event looking so incredibly bare and cheap." Trey lunged forward, closing the distance between us in a split second until he was towering aggressively over me. His face was twisted in a dangerous mixture of raw panic and intense, unhinged rage. He grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging painfully tight into my sleeve, but I did not even flinch. I did not step back. I stared right back into his terrified, desperate eyes. "Listen to me, you little nobody," he hissed through clenched teeth, his breath hot against my face. "You are going to go back out to that machine, and you are going to push the charge through manually. You are going to override the system right now and make it work." I calmly looked down at his hand aggressively gripping my arm, and then I slowly looked back up to his face. "I highly suggest you let go of me right this second, Trey." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before quickly releasing his grip, taking a half step back, but keeping his aggressive, threatening posture. I smoothed out the wrinkled sleeve of my cashmere sweater. "The Athenaeum has a very strict corporate policy," I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional and icy cold. "We do not perform manual overrides for external vendors under any circumstances whatsoever. If the issuing bank has locked the account for fraud, there is absolutely nothing I can do to force it. You will need to call your accounting department directly and have them verbally authorize the charge to release the funds." Trey let out a desperate, choked laugh. "Call accounting? Are you insane? I cannot call them." He caught himself instantly realizing he was verbally admitting to his own financial crimes. "I mean, they are in a massive quarterly review meeting all day today. They cannot be disturbed for something as trivial as flower arrangements." "Then the flowers will have to go," I stated simply, turning my back to walk away down the hall. "Wait!" Trey shouted, his voice echoing sharply against the antique wooden panels. He reached into his designer suit pocket and pulled out his expensive leather wallet. His hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped it onto the floor. He fumbled with the leather folds and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He crumpled the money tightly in his fist and threw it aggressively directly at my chest. The bill hit me softly and fluttered pathetically to the marble floor between my feet. "Take it," he spat, his eyes wild and completely desperate. "Take the money and keep your mouth shut. You do not tell Amanda. You do not tell your parents. You just go out there and tell the florist there was a banking glitch, and they will be paid via wire transfer first thing tomorrow morning. If you breathe a single word of this declined card to anyone in my family, I swear to God, I will have my boss call the board of directors here and have you fired so fast your head will spin. You will be back to begging on the streets where you belong." I looked down at the crumpled $100 bill lying on the floor. I did not feel insulted by his physical disrespect. I felt an overwhelming electric surge of total victory. He was completely out of options, resorting to throwing pocket change at me in a pathetic last-ditch attempt to buy my silence. I slowly bent down and picked up the bill. I smoothed out the creases with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I looked back up at Trey, offering him my brightest, most pleasant, customer service-oriented smile. "Thank you for your very generous tip, sir," I said smoothly. I pulled my work tablet from under my arm, opened the employee portal, and logged the cash. I tapped the screen a few times, and a digital receipt was instantly generated in our system. I turned the tablet around to face him. "As you can see, I have formally logged this into the corporate gratuity system. I assure you, your secret is completely safe with me. I will gladly inform the vendor of the delay." Trey stared at the digital receipt on my screen, his chest heaving heavily, his face contorted in absolute helpless fury. He wanted to scream at me, to hit me, to do absolutely anything to regain control of the spiraling situation. But he knew he was completely trapped. He turned around and stormed down the hallway, kicking a heavy mahogany door open and disappearing into the grand foyer. I stood alone in the hallway, tucking the $100 bill into my pocket. He thought he was buying my silence and saving his pride. He had absolutely no idea he was just paying for a front row seat to his own total destruction. The corporate card was frozen tight. The fraudulent contract was locked securely in my safe. The deed to my parents' house was legally transferred to my holding company. Every single piece was perfectly in place. Tomorrow night, the curtain would finally rise on the most spectacular downfall Chicago high society had ever witnessed. The evening of the 25th arrived with a crisp autumn chill, but inside the Athenaeum, the atmosphere was electric and suffocatingly opulent. The grand foyer was completely transformed. Thousands of imported white orchids cascaded down the sweeping mahogany staircases and draped heavily over the second-floor balconies, filling the air with a sweet, intoxicating fragrance. A live string quartet played a seamless blend of classical masterpieces and modern pop hits in the corner of the room. Waitstaff in crisp white tuxedo tails glided across the polished marble floors, balancing silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of vintage champagne and delicate Wagyu beef hors d'oeuvres. The financial elite of Chicago poured through the heavy brass doors, shedding their expensive coats and stepping into the glowing warmth of the main hall. Amanda and Trey stood at the top of the grand staircase, greeting their guests like reigning royalty holding court. Amanda was wearing a breathtaking custom-made silk gown that shimmered under the massive crystal chandeliers. She looked radiant, entirely oblivious to the absolute financial inferno raging just beneath her feet. Trey was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored tuxedo that accentuated his athletic build. He stood tall, exuding the effortless confidence of a highly successful African-American hedge fund manager at the absolute peak of his career. He laughed loudly at jokes made by his colleagues, slapping wealthy clients on the back, and firmly shaking hands with the senior partners of his firm. He was schmoozing aggressively, working the room with a desperate, manic energy. I watched from the shadows of the second-floor corridor, my event coordinator clipboard tucked under my arm and a discreet earpiece in my ear. I saw him intercept his boss, Richard, near the bar. Trey poured Richard a glass of scotch, leaning in close and talking with animated, grandiose gestures, practically begging for the senior partner promotion he believed would save him. He was completely faking it, hiding the sheer terror that was undoubtedly consuming him from the inside out. I checked my watch and tapped my earpiece, instructing the catering director to prepare the first course. I walked down the back service stairs, making my way toward the massive industrial kitchens to ensure the plating was completely flawless. The hallway leading to the kitchen was dimly lit and relatively quiet, heavily insulated from the loud chatter and music of the main ballroom. As I reached for the swinging metal door, a sharp, manicured hand grabbed my shoulder and spun me around roughly. It was Brenda. She had abandoned Thomas by the cocktail tables and followed me into the service corridor. Her face was flushed with champagne and sheer adrenaline, her eyes narrow and completely venomous. She checked over her shoulder to ensure the hallway was completely empty before pinning me against the wall with a fiercely aggressive glare. "Listen to me very carefully, Sophie." My mother hissed, her voice vibrating with toxic intensity. "This night is absolute perfection so far. Richard is already incredibly impressed with the venue, and half the board of directors from Trey's firm are currently eating out of Amanda's hand. This party is the final push Trey needs to secure that senior partner position. If he gets it, our family is set for life." I looked at her, my face a completely blank canvas. "Are you enjoying the champagne, Brenda?" "Do not play games with me," she snapped, stepping even closer, invading my personal space. "I know you are incredibly jealous of your sister. You always have been. You are a bitter, lonely woman who peaked as a public school teacher. But I swear to God, if you do absolutely anything to ruin this night, if you embarrass this family, or cause even a single delay with the food or the service, I will personally destroy what is left of your pathetic little life. I will call your manager. I will tell them you stole from us. I will make sure you are fired and blacklisted from every event planning company in the city." I kept my hands resting calmly at my sides. I subtly curled my left wrist inward, feeling the cold metal of my Apple Watch against my skin. With a tiny practiced movement of my thumb, I tapped the screen, activating the voice memo recording application. A tiny red microphone icon flashed to life, silently capturing every single word. "You seem incredibly stressed for someone attending a party they did not even pay for," I replied evenly, provoking her just enough to make her lose her temper. Brenda took the bait instantly, her face contorted in pure, unadulterated rage. "You arrogant little brat," she spat, pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. "You have absolutely no idea what real sacrifice looks like. You think this level of luxury just happens? We have sacrificed everything for this night. Thomas and I have not paid our mortgage in 3 straight months, just so we could afford to buy Amanda that custom designer dress she is wearing right now. We put everything on the line to make sure she looks like a billionaire's wife tonight." I stared at her, genuinely amazed by the sheer magnitude of her financial stupidity. "You defaulted on your mortgage, the mortgage you just put up as collateral for this venue just to buy a dress. It is called an investment, Sophie." Brenda sneered, entirely missing the horrifying irony of her own confession. "Once Trey gets this massive promotion, he is going to pay us back tenfold. He promised us a complete renovation of our colonial house and a new luxury car. So you will stay in the kitchen where you belong, you will serve the food quietly, and you will not dare show your face in that ballroom while the important people are networking. Do you understand me?" I looked down at my watch, quietly stopping the recording and saving the crystal-clear audio file to my secure cloud storage. I looked back up at my mother, offering her a chilling, empty smile. "I understand perfectly, Brenda," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You have bet absolutely everything on Trey. I will make sure the rest of the evening goes exactly the way you deserve." Brenda scoffed loudly, adjusting her fake Chanel jacket and turning on her heel. "See that you do?" she threw over her shoulder as she marched proudly back toward the glowing lights of the ballroom. I stood alone in the quiet service hallway, the recording safely secured on my wrist. Brenda had just handed me the final nail for her own coffin. She had openly admitted to defaulting on the mortgage that I now legally owned, proving extreme financial negligence. I pushed open the heavy metal doors and walked into the bustling kitchen. The first course was ready to be served, but the real feast of the evening was just about to begin. I grabbed a silver tray of champagne and prepared to step out into the ballroom. It was time for the event coordinator to make her grand appearance. I pushed through the swinging metal doors of the service corridor and stepped seamlessly into the sea of evening gowns and tailored tuxedos. The main ballroom of the Athenaeum was a breathtaking spectacle of extreme wealth and calculated networking. I balanced the heavy silver tray of champagne flutes on one hand, weaving effortlessly through the crowd of Chicago's financial elite. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my expression an unreadable mask of professional courtesy. Across the room, Trey was deep in conversation with his boss, Richard. Richard was a formidable-looking man with silver hair, a tailored charcoal suit, and a sharp, calculating gaze that seemed to dissect everything he looked at. He was examining the imported white orchids cascading from the balconies with an impressed nod. Trey was sweating profusely, subtly dabbing his forehead with a linen handkerchief, but he was grinning like a lottery winner. He thought he had pulled it off. He truly believed the fraudulent contract locked in my safe and the frozen corporate card were safely hidden beneath the sheer glamour of the evening. Suddenly, the sharp, piercing ring of a silver spoon tapping against a crystal glass echoed through the massive hall. The string quartet immediately ceased playing. The loud chatter of 200 guests died down to a respectful, expectant hush. Amanda was standing on the grand staircase halfway up to the landing, illuminated perfectly by the massive crystal chandelier overhead. She held a microphone in one hand and a flute of champagne in the other. Her custom silk gown sparkled brilliantly in the warm light. She looked like the absolute picture of a loving, devoted, and obscenely wealthy wife. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight." Amanda began, her voice echoing clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system I had personally installed. "Tonight is not just about celebrating 5 incredible years of marriage to my wonderful husband Trey. It is about celebrating the hard work, the immense dedication, and the brilliant success that has allowed us to share this magnificent evening with all of you." The crowd murmured in polite agreement. Trey puffed out his chest, raising his glass toward his wife, completely eating up the validation. Amanda continued her sickeningly sweet monologue, praising Trey for his tireless work ethic and his unparalleled financial genius at the hedge fund. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, offering a fresh glass of champagne to a passing guest completely unfazed by her delusional performance. It was actually hilarious to listen to her praise his financial genius, knowing he had committed a massive felony just to rent the room she was currently standing in. Then Amanda paused. Her eyes scanned the crowded room and locked directly onto me. A slow, incredibly malicious smile spread across her perfectly painted lips. She could not resist. Even with absolutely everything she had, she still desperately needed to publicly crush me to make herself feel truly superior. "We are so blessed to be surrounded by our wonderful family tonight," Amanda purred into the microphone, her eyes burning into mine with toxic intensity. "My amazing parents are here. But I also want to take a special moment to acknowledge someone else. Someone who has been somewhat estranged from us for the last 3 years, but who graciously decided to attend tonight in her own unique way." The crowd turned their heads, following Amanda's gaze directly to where I was standing, in my simple, understated event coordinator uniform holding my serving tray. "Everyone, please put your hands together and thank my older sister, Sophie," Amanda announced, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. She could not quite make it in the real world of high finance and corporate success like the rest of us. Teaching did not exactly pan out for her either, but as you can all see, she pours a truly fantastic glass of champagne. Let us hear it for the hired help. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the entire ballroom, the kind of absolute agonizing quiet that makes the air feel thick and incredibly difficult to breathe. A few scattered, incredibly awkward laughs broke the tension, followed by a handful of polite, hesitant claps from guests who did not fully understand the vicious family dynamic playing out before them. I glanced over at Richard Trey's boss. His brow was slightly furrowed. He did not laugh. He did not clap. As a man of genuine wealth and power, he clearly found the blatant public shaming of a service worker, let alone a family member, incredibly distasteful. Thomas and Brenda, however, beamed with cruel pride from their VIP cocktail table. Trey smirked openly, clearly enjoying the public execution of my dignity, fully believing this would finally put me in my place. But I did not shrink away. I did not drop my gaze. I did not run out of the room in tears like the broken, defeated sister they desperately wanted me to be. Instead, I stood completely still. I looked right up at Amanda standing on her grand pedestal. I reached onto my own silver tray and picked up a crystal flute of champagne. With absolute chilling calmness, I raised the glass directly toward her in a silent, mocking salute. I took a slow sip, maintaining unbreakable deadpan eye contact with her the entire time. Amanda's triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. My utter lack of humiliation deeply unnerved her. She expected me to shatter under the weight of her public insult, but I was completely impenetrable. She quickly recovered, clearing her throat and turning her attention back to Richard and the other senior partners, desperately trying to steer the toast back to her husband's impending promotion. I set the empty glass back onto my tray and turned to walk toward the main entrance. I had played the role of the humiliated servant to absolute perfection. I had let them build their massive house of cards as high as it could possibly go. I wanted them to feel invincible, because the higher the pedestal, the more devastating the fall. As I reached the grand mahogany doors leading out to the foyer, a sleek black town car pulled up to the valet stand outside. Through the glass, I saw my private security team rush forward to pull the heavy doors open. The air in the foyer suddenly shifted, crackling with a completely different kind of energy. The man walking through those doors was not just another wealthy hedge fund manager or a local real estate investor trying to play pretend. He was a genuine titan of industry, and his scheduled arrival was the exact catalyst that was about to rip the mask off my family's entire fraudulent existence in a matter of minutes. The freezing Chicago wind whipped briefly through the grand foyer as my private security team pulled the heavy brass doors wide open. Stepping over the threshold was Elias Maxwell. In the world of global finance and technology, Elias was not just a prominent figure, he was an absolute titan. As the founder of a massive tech conglomerate and a prominent billionaire philanthropist, his face was regularly plastered across the covers of financial magazines worldwide. He was also the senior board member of the very library foundation I had established after purchasing the Athenaeum. Unlike the desperate, flashy attendees inside the ballroom, Elias did not wear a diamond-encrusted watch or a tuxedo tailored to scream for attention. He wore a simple, impeccably cut charcoal suit. He carried an aura of quiet, undeniable power. It was the kind of absolute authority that true generational wealth provides, the kind that never needs to loudly announce its presence in a room. The moment Elias stepped into the light of the foyer, the entire energy of the anniversary gala shifted violently. The string quartet, recognizing the billionaire, instantly faltered for a half-second before attempting to smooth out their melody. A frantic wave of hushed whispers spread across the ballroom floor like wildfire. I watched Richard Trey's incredibly demanding boss practically choke on his expensive scotch. From my vantage point near the entrance, I turned my attention directly to Trey. The transformation in his demeanor was instantaneous and deeply pathetic. His eyes dilated with predatory excitement. He looked at Elias Maxwell not as a human being, but as a giant walking pile of money that could instantly solve every single one of his catastrophic problems. If Trey could somehow secure even a fraction of Elias Maxwell's investment portfolio for his hedge fund, the senior partner promotion would be handed to him on a silver platter. The frozen corporate card and the forged signature would be swept entirely under the rug. Without a single second of hesitation, Trey completely abandoned his wife. Amanda was still standing on the lower steps of the grand staircase, holding her microphone, desperately waiting for her husband to return to her side to conclude their sickeningly fake toast. But Trey did not even look back at her. He shoved his crystal champagne flute into the hands of a passing waiter, accidentally spilling the expensive wine onto the polished marble, and began power walking toward the foyer. Trey practically shoved two wealthy clients out of his way, completely abandoning all social etiquette in his desperate sprint for financial salvation. He smoothed down his lapels, plastered on his most aggressive, confident salesman smile, and stepped directly into Elias Maxwell's path, effectively blocking the billionaire from entering the main ballroom. "Mr. Maxwell," Trey announced loudly, ensuring his voice carried over the quiet murmurs of the crowd so his boss could hear him taking the initiative. "It is an absolute honor to have you at my anniversary gala tonight. I am Trey, the lead portfolio manager at Richard Dalton's firm. I have been following your recent tech acquisitions closely, and I would love to schedule a private meeting to discuss a highly lucrative leverage strategy my fund has developed specifically for your sector." Trey thrust his right hand forward, offering a firm, aggressive handshake. He stood there, chest puffed out, waiting for the billionaire to recognize his supposed brilliance. The silence that followed was physically painful. Elias Maxwell did not stop walking. He did not smile. He did not even blink. He slowly lowered his gaze, looking at Trey's outstretched, sweating hand, with the exact same expression one might use when looking at a piece of discarded chewing gum on the sidewalk. He did not say a single word to Trey. He simply turned his head slightly, toward his towering head of personal security. "Excuse me," Elias said, his voice cold, deep, and completely devoid of any interest. "You are blocking my path." Trey's aggressive salesman's smile instantly shattered. His outstretched hand hung frozen in the empty air, completely ignored. His face flushed a deep, humiliating shade of purple as Elias's security detail seamlessly stepped forward physically, forcing Trey to step backward out of the way. Richard, watching from the bar, buried his face in his hand in sheer, unadulterated embarrassment. Trey had just aggressively pitched a billionaire at a private social event and had been swatted away like an annoying insect in front of his entire firm. With the desperate hedge fund manager properly moved aside, Elias Maxwell stepped fully into the ballroom. He did not look at the lavish floral arrangements. He did not look at the expensive catering. His sharp eyes scanned the room with practiced efficiency until they locked directly onto me. I was still standing quietly near the edge of the foyer, dressed in my simple dark event coordinator uniform, holding my empty silver serving tray. I did not move. I simply waited. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Elias walked directly toward me. Every single eye in the Athenaeum followed his movements. I could feel the intense burning confusion radiating from Amanda on the staircase and from my parents at their VIP table. Why was a famous tech billionaire walking purposefully toward the hired help they had just spent the last 10 minutes publicly humiliating? Elias stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. The entire ballroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Trey was staring with his mouth slightly open, completely paralyzed by the unfolding scene. Elias did not offer me a handshake. Instead, to the absolute shock of the 200 financial elites watching us, the billionaire bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound, undeniable respect. When he spoke, he did not whisper. He projected his voice perfectly, allowing the incredible acoustics of my historic library to carry his words to every single corner of the massive room. Madam CEO Elias announced loudly, a warm, genuine smile breaking across his previously stern face. "I apologize for my late arrival. The board of directors held an emergency vote this afternoon regarding your proposal. I am thrilled to report they have unanimously approved your $5 million renovation budget for the new children's educational wing. The Athenaeum is entirely yours to shape as you see fit." The words hung in the air like a detonated explosive. "Madam CEO, your proposal. Your $5 million budget. The Athenaeum is entirely yours." A collective audible gasp rippled through the sea of guests. I handed my silver tray to David, the junior archivist, who was grinning from ear to ear. I stood up perfectly straight, shedding the invisible weight of the servant role I had been playing all week. I looked past Elias, locking my eyes directly onto Trey and Amanda. Their faces were completely drained of color, their eyes wide with a horrifying, crushing realization. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had completely obliterated them. The deafening silence that gripped the room was finally broken by a sharp, violent crash. Amanda's delicate fingers had completely gone limp. Her crystal champagne flute slipped from her grasp and plummeted down the marble steps of the grand staircase, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces. The loud noise echoed off the vaulted ceilings, but no one in the crowd even blinked. Every single person was entirely frozen, their eyes locked on the impossible scene unfolding at the center of the foyer. Trey looked like he was having a severe medical emergency. His jaw was slack, and his eyes darted frantically between Elias Maxwell, the most powerful man in the room, and me, the sister-in-law he had been mercilessly degrading for the past 3 years. His brain simply refused to process the words, "Madam CEO." To his arrogant, deeply flawed logic, there had to be a colossal misunderstanding. The billionaire was obviously confusing me with someone else. Trey forced a nervous, high-pitched chuckle that sounded more like a dry heave. He stepped forward again, desperately trying to salvage the situation and insert himself back into the billionaire's good graces. He could not accept that his entire reality was crumbling. Sir Trey stammered, wiping a fresh layer of cold sweat from his forehead. "Mr. Maxwell, I believe you have made a rather embarrassing mistake. This woman is not a CEO. Her name is Sophie. She is my wife's estranged sister. She is just the event coordinator for our party tonight. She is a former public school teacher who handles the logistics here. You must be confusing her with the actual owner of the property." Elias Maxwell slowly turned his head away from me and looked at Trey. The billionaire did not look angry. Instead, a look of profound, genuine amusement washed over his face. He let out a rich, booming laugh that cut through the thick tension of the room. It was not a polite chuckle. He was laughing directly and unashamedly right into Trey's panicked face. "Event coordinator." Elias repeated, his voice practically dripping with disbelief and mockery. "Are you entirely out of your mind? Sophie is not the event coordinator. She is the sole proprietor of the Chicago Athenaeum. She bought this entire historic building in cold hard cash last month." Trey took a physical step back as if he had just been violently punched in the chest. His mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land, but no words came out. On the staircase, Amanda grabbed the heavy wooden banister to physically support her weight, her knees visibly buckling under the sheer force of the revelation. Her custom designer gown suddenly looked incredibly cheap, a fragile costume worn by a woman who was entirely bankrupt. Elias was not finished. He turned to address the crowd of elite financial guests, raising his voice so every single person, including Trey's fiercely intimidating boss Richard, could hear him with crystal clarity. "For those of you who have not yet had the privilege of knowing her," Elias announced, grandly gesturing toward me with immense respect, "Sophie is one of the most brilliant minds in modern educational technology. She spent the last 3 years quietly building a revolutionary early childhood learning platform from the ground up. A platform that was so incredibly successful, Google acquired it last month for $45 million. The murmurs in the crowd instantly ignited. The hushed whispers violently escalated into a deafening roar of shocked conversations. The financial elites, the senior partners, the incredibly wealthy clients Trey had spent the entire evening aggressively kissing up to, were now openly staring at me with deep reverence and intense curiosity. In their world, money was gravity, and I had just become the sun. I was no longer the pathetic servant pouring their drinks. I was suddenly the wealthiest, most powerful person in the room. Google, $45 million, bought the building in cash. The words bounced around the grand foyer, each one acting like a physical blow to my family's fragile, fraudulent egos. At their VIP table, Brenda and Thomas looked like they had just been struck by lightning. Thomas gripped the edge of the cocktail table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. Brenda's face was drained of all color, her heavy makeup making her look like a terrifying wax figure melting under the bright chandelier lights. They were finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of their mistake. They had handed the deed to their colonial house directly to the secret multi-million-dollar owner of the building. They had just spent the last 3 days mocking, belittling, and threatening the very woman who now completely owned their financial future. Trey shook his head rapidly, his eyes wide and manic. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking violently. "No, that is impossible. She is a nobody. She drove here in a cheap car. She was carrying boxes of books. She signed my rental contract as the coordinator." Ah, yes, the contract. I finally spoke, my voice calm, smooth, and carrying perfectly over the roaring crowd. The noise in the room immediately died down again as everyone leaned in desperate to hear what I had to say. I handed my clipboard to David, the junior archivist, and took a slow, deliberate step toward Trey. I did not need to raise my voice. The sheer authority in my tone commanded absolute silence. "I did sign your rental contract, Trey," I said, looking directly into his terrified eyes. "But as I clearly recall, you also signed it. You signed your name as the primary sponsor, and then you very confidently forged Richard's signature as the corporate guarantor." A loud collective gasp echoed from the front row of the crowd, where the hedge fund employees were gathered. Richard's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing into deadly, furious slits as he stared directly at Trey's back. Trey's legs completely gave out. He stumbled backward and fell heavily onto the polished marble floor, scrambling frantically away from me like a cornered animal. He looked up at me, his chest heaving, his perfect tailored suit now wrinkled and pathetic. The absolute terror in his eyes was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The first mask had completely slipped, shattering into a million unfixable pieces on the floor, right alongside Amanda's broken champagne glass. But I was not even close to being done. I had promised my mother that this evening would go exactly the way they deserved, and I always keep my promises. I stepped forward, leaving Elias Maxwell standing in the center of the grand foyer. The sea of wealthy guests parted for me instantly, their eyes tracking my every movement with a mixture of profound awe and intense curiosity. I walked slowly and deliberately toward the grand mahogany staircase. My sensible flats made no sound against the marble, a stark contrast to the loud, desperate clicking of Amanda's designer heels from earlier. I climbed the steps one by one, feeling the heavy, suffocating silence of the room, amplifying the power of the moment. Amanda was still clinging desperately to the wooden banister, her knuckles completely white. Her chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. She looked like a fragile porcelain doll that had just been violently shattered. As I reached her level on the landing, she did not move. Her wide, terrified eyes stared at me completely, unable to process the reality that the sister she had bullied for decades was now holding absolute power over her life. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the microphone she was holding. She was practically paralyzed. I gave a firm, smooth pull, easily sliding the microphone out of her trembling hand. She let out a tiny, pathetic whimper, but I completely ignored her. I turned my back to my sister and faced the massive crowd of Chicago's elite. The bright glare of the crystal chandelier washed over me. For the first time in my entire life, I was not standing in the shadows of my family's fabricated perfection. I was standing in the absolute center of the stage, and I owned the entire theater. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice echoing powerfully through the speakers. "First of all, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to Elias Maxwell and the Library Board for their unwavering support of the Athenaeum's new educational initiatives. It is a profound honor to preserve this historic building and expand its reach to the children of Chicago." A wave of genuine, respectful applause broke out across the room, led by Richard from the front row. I waited patiently for the clapping to subside before continuing. "We are all gathered here tonight under the pretense of celebrating a milestone," I said, my tone shifting from polite to razor-sharp. "A 5-year wedding anniversary, a showcase of immense success, unparalleled wealth, and deep family devotion. But as you may have noticed, things are rarely exactly as they appear on the surface." I looked directly down at the VIP table. Brenda had a napkin pressed tightly to her mouth, her eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for an escape route. Thomas sat frozen, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated dread. Amanda mentioned earlier that I was estranged from this family. I continued pacing slowly across the landing, and she was absolutely right. But she conveniently left out the exact reason why. So since we are surrounded by such esteemed guests, I think it is only fair to share the real story of our estrangement. In fact, I want to take this highly public opportunity to deeply and sincerely thank my parents and my sister. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. Trey, still sitting pathetically on the floor near the entrance, stared up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. "You see, 3 years ago on Christmas Eve, I received a text message from my mother," I announced, my voice carrying a cold, unforgiving clarity. "She formally uninvited me to their holiday dinner. She told me that I was a complete embarrassment to the family name because I had chosen to be a lowly public school teacher. She told me she no longer saw me as her daughter." I paused, letting the sheer cruelty of those words sink into the minds of the audience. Several guests gasped openly. Richard crossed his arms, his face hardening into a look of absolute disgust as he glared at Trey and Amanda. "What my mother did not tell you," I continued, locking eyes with Brenda, "is that for 5 years prior to that exact moment, my lowly teacher salary was the only thing keeping a roof over their heads. I was the primary financial co-signer on their massive colonial estate. While they leased luxury cars and bought custom designer gowns to impress people like you, I was quietly emptying my modest savings account every single month to pay their heavily defaulted property taxes. I lived in a tiny, cramped apartment, skipping meals and living incredibly frugally just to fund their desperate illusion of high society wealth. The silence in the room was deafening. The financial elites were completely captivated, staring at my parents with raw, unfiltered contempt. In their world, nothing was more pathetic than people faking their wealth by bleeding a public servant dry. But that Christmas Eve, I finally woke up. I said, my voice rising with undeniable triumph. I walked into their house, handed them the legal paperwork, removing my name from their financial ruin, and I walked away forever. And that is exactly why I need to thank them tonight. Being disowned was the absolute greatest gift they could have ever given me. I turned slightly, gesturing to the magnificent library around us. By cutting me off, they freed me from a lifetime of relentless financial abuse and toxic manipulation. Without the heavy burden of paying their mortgage and funding their fake lifestyle, I finally had the time, the resources, and the mental peace to sit in my tiny apartment and code. I poured my heart into creating Scholar Steps. I built a revolutionary educational platform that eventually changed the lives of millions of children. And when a major tech conglomerate purchased my company last month for $45 million, the very first thing I did was buy this historic library. I looked back at Amanda, who was now weeping silently, her makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. I looked at Trey on the floor, his entire career and reputation completely destroyed in a matter of minutes. So thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Amanda. I owe my incredible wealth and my absolute freedom entirely to your boundless greed and your staggering cruelty. You tried to bury me because you thought I was nothing but dirt, but you completely forgot that I was a seed. I lowered the microphone. The family stood absolutely frozen in horror. They were entirely trapped in a cage of their own making, illuminated by the bright chandeliers, completely exposed to the unforgiving judgment of the very society they had sacrificed everything to impress. The applause that erupted from the crowd this time was not polite. It was roaring, thunderous, and completely deafening, and it was all for me. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, letting the thunderous applause wash over me. For a moment, I allowed myself to simply exist in the glow of my own hard-won success. But only for a moment. I had not bought this library or orchestrated this entire evening just to give a motivational speech. I was here to dismantle the parasitic forces that had plagued my life piece by piece. As the applause finally began to die down, the reality of the situation crashed back onto the shoulders of my family. Trey, still sprawled on the polished marble floor of the foyer, scrambled frantically to his feet. His tailored tuxedo was rumpled, and his usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for any sliver of sympathy or support. He found absolutely none. The financial elite of Chicago, the very people he had spent the last 5 years desperately trying to impress, were now looking at him with undisguised revulsion. In their cutthroat world, weakness and exposure were cardinal sins, and Trey was currently the poster boy for both. He turned his frantic gaze toward Richard, his boss, who was standing in the front row. Richard's face was an impenetrable mask of cold fury. Trey took a stumbling step toward him, his hands raised in a desperate pleading gesture. "Richard, please," Trey begged, his voice cracking loudly in the now quiet ballroom. "You have to understand, this is a massive misunderstanding. She is lying. She is a bitter, vindictive woman who has always been jealous of Amanda. She is just trying to humiliate us because she feels inferior. I swear to you, none of this is true." Richard did not move a muscle. He simply stared at Trey, his silence louder and more damning than any accusation. I watched Trey's desperate flailing from the landing. It was almost pitiful the way he clung to his shattered illusion, completely oblivious to the fact that the final blow had not even been struck yet. I raised the microphone back to my lips. My voice, calm and amplified, cut through Trey's pathetic whimpering like a surgical blade. Speaking of misunderstandings, I said smoothly, turning my attention directly to the front row. Richard, since you are here, I have a rather pressing administrative question for you regarding the booking of this venue. Richard's cold gaze shifted from Trey up to me. He nodded slightly, acknowledging my authority. Yes, Madam CEO. How can I assist you? I offered him a polite, entirely professional smile. As the sole proprietor of the Athenaeum, I personally handle the final approval of all high-tier event contracts. 2 days ago, Trey booked the Platinum package for this anniversary gala, which carries a total cost of $100,000. The crowd murmured again the sheer extravagance of the price tag, causing a ripple of raised eyebrows among the guests. Even in this room of immense wealth, dropping $100,000 on a 5-year anniversary was considered excessively flashy. Trey froze, his back stiffening as if he had just been shot. He slowly turned his head to look up at me, his eyes wide with a new, much deeper level of sheer terror. Now, standard policy dictates that the primary sponsor must provide a valid method of payment and a signature guaranteeing the funds. I continued, my voice steady and deliberate. Trey provided a corporate expense card issued by your firm to cover the $20,000 non-refundable deposit. Richard's jaw clenched visibly. He took a slow, calculated step forward, his eyes never leaving mine. A corporate expense card, he repeated, his voice dangerously low. I nodded in confirmation. Yes. And while the initial deposit did clear, the card was subsequently declined yesterday when I attempted to process the payment for the floral vendor. The terminal indicated a severe fraud alert lock had been placed on the account. A collective gasp echoed from the cluster of hedge fund employees standing near Richard. They knew exactly what a fraud lock on a corporate card meant. It meant their supposedly brilliant portfolio manager was actively stealing from them. Trey let out a strangled, desperate noise. Sophie, shut up, he hissed, completely abandoning any pretense of professionalism. You do not know what you are talking about. It was a glitch, a banking error. I completely ignored him, keeping my focus locked entirely on Richard. But the declined card is only part of the issue. Richard, I said, my voice ringing clear and true. In order to secure the remaining $80,000 balance, our insurance policy requires a secondary guarantor if a corporate account is used. Trey assured me that his entertainment budget had been fully approved by senior management. He then proceeded to sign the contract right in front of me, guaranteeing the full amount. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, drawing the tension tight before finally snapping the wire. He signed your name, Richard. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on every single person in the room. Richard stood perfectly still for 3 long seconds. Then very slowly he turned his head to look at Trey. The look in Richard's eyes was not anger. It was something much colder, much more dangerous. It was the look of a predator analyzing a severely injured prey. Trey physically recoiled, taking 2 rapid steps backward, until his back hit the mahogany wall of the foyer. He raised his hands defensively, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw breath. Richard, no, Trey pleaded, his voice nothing more than a desperate, trembling whisper. She is lying. I never signed your name. I would never do that. She is trying to destroy me. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my smartphone. With a few quick taps, I connected the device to the Athenaeum's state-of-the-art projection system. I had prepared for this exact moment. Perhaps we should let the documentation speak for itself, I said evenly. The massive white wall behind the grand staircase, normally used for projecting elegant monograms or romantic slideshows, suddenly illuminated. A crisp, high-resolution image of the booking contract flashed onto the wall, easily 10 feet tall. Every single detail was clearly visible to the entire room. I highlighted the signature block at the bottom of the document. There, in stark, undeniable black and white, was Trey's signature on the primary line. And directly beneath it, on the secondary guarantor line, was the perfectly forged, unmistakable signature of Richard Dalton. The collective intake of breath from the audience sounded like a vacuum sealing the room. The evidence was irrefutable. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not a glitch. It was documented, blatant corporate fraud. Richard stared at his forged signature projected on the wall, his expression hardening into a terrifying mask of absolute resolve. He turned back to Trey, who was now practically hyperventilating against the wall. The final thread holding Trey's fabricated life together had just violently snapped, and he was completely, utterly exposed. Richard Dalton did not yell. In the cutthroat world of high finance, the most dangerous men never needed to raise their voices to command absolute authority. He simply adjusted his tailored charcoal suit jacket and began walking slowly toward the massive projection on the wall. The crowd of elite guests parted for him instantly, holding their collective breath, their eyes darting between the angry senior partner and the trembling portfolio manager. Trey remained pinned against the mahogany paneling of the foyer, his eyes wide with animalistic panic, watching his boss approach with the slow, deliberate pace of an executioner. Richard stopped just a few feet from the illuminated wall. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a pair of silver reading glasses, and slipped them onto his face. For an agonizingly long minute, he studied the digital contract. He analyzed the specific strokes of the forged signature, comparing it to his own mental record. The silence in the Athenaeum was so profound, I could hear the faint, steady hum of the projector above my head. Finally, Richard took off his glasses, folded them carefully, and tucked them back into his pocket. His face was no longer just a mask of cold resolve. It had turned a deep, furious shade of purple. He turned away from the projected screen and locked his gaze entirely onto Trey. "You stupid, arrogant little man," Richard said, his voice echoing clearly and sharply across the dead, silent room. "Did you honestly believe you could run a $100,000 personal expense through our corporate accounts and simply forge my authorization to cover your tracks? We manage billions of dollars for institutional investors, Trey. Our entire firm is built on absolute trust, transparency, and rigorous legal compliance. You did not just steal money to throw a flashy party for your wife. You actively committed felony corporate fraud and severely jeopardized the integrity of my entire fund." Trey pushed himself off the wall, his hands shaking violently as he took a tentative, desperate step toward his boss. "Richard, please listen to me." Trey pleaded, tears of pure terror welling up in his eyes. "It was a temporary lapse in judgment. I was going to pay it all back with my end-of-year bonus. I swear to you on my life. I just needed to float the cash for a few days to make this anniversary perfect for Amanda. You know how hard I work for you. You know my portfolio returns are the highest in the department. I am an asset to you." "Your portfolio returns mean absolutely nothing to me now," Richard snapped, stepping forward and closing the distance between them until he was standing chest to chest with Trey. "You are a massive liability. You are a criminal. As of this exact moment, your employment at my firm is permanently terminated." The words hit Trey like a physical blow to the stomach, but Richard was far from finished delivering his sentence. "I am immediately freezing all of your stock options, your 401k matches, and your severance package to recover the stolen funds." Richard continued, mercilessly stripping away every single ounce of Trey's financial security in front of 200 people. "I will be contacting the authorities and our corporate legal team first thing tomorrow morning to file formal charges for embezzlement, wire fraud, and forgery. Do not attempt to log into our secure servers. Do not attempt to contact a single one of our clients. My private security team will escort you to the office at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning so you can pack up your personal belongings in a cardboard box under strict armed supervision. And after that, you had better find yourself a very good criminal defense attorney, because I am going to make absolutely sure you spend the next 10 years in a federal prison." Trey let out a guttural, agonizing sob. The last remaining pillar holding up his massive ego completely crumbled. His legs finally gave out and he collapsed heavily onto his knees right in front of Richard. The loud crack of his kneecaps hitting the polished marble floor echoed through the foyer. He reached out, trying to grab the hem of Richard's suit jacket, begging and crying like a petulant, terrified child. Richard simply took a step back in sheer disgust, swatting Trey's hand away and refusing to even look down at him anymore. Realizing that his boss was completely immovable and his high-flying career was officially dead, Trey's profound despair instantly warped into vicious, cornered anger. He stayed on his knees, but he spun around to face the grand staircase. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Amanda, who was still paralyzed on the landing just below me. "This is all your fault," Trey screamed at his wife, his voice cracking with raw, unhinged hysteria. "You did this to me. You and your psychotic obsession with looking rich." Amanda gasped loudly, taking a step back as if he had physically struck her across the face. "Trey, what are you saying?" she whispered, her voice trembling with shock. "I am saying you bled me completely dry," he roared, the veins in his neck bulging against his expensive silk collar. Every single day it was a new demand, a new designer bag, a new luxury vacation, a new leased car we could not afford just so you could post photos and pretend you were better than everyone else. My salary was never enough for you. You told me if this anniversary party was not the most extravagant event of the entire year, you would divorce me and take half of everything. You forced me to steal this money. You held a gun to my head with your pathetic, insatiable vanity. The crowd of billionaires and financial elites murmured in deep revulsion, watching a marriage built entirely on fake wealth and manipulation violently implode in real time. Trey did not stop with Amanda. He turned his manic, tear-stained face toward my parents at their VIP table. "And you two are just as bad," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger directly at Brenda and Thomas. "You enabled her entirely. You drained my bank accounts too, always asking for loans you never repaid, always expecting me to fund your ridiculous country club lifestyle because Thomas is a broke, failed businessman who has not made a real dime in 10 years. I ruined my entire life, my career, and my freedom for this parasitic family." I stood quietly on the stage, the microphone resting silently at my side, watching the beautiful, chaotic destruction unfold below me. I did not need to say another word. Trey was doing all the heavy lifting for me. He was tearing down the elaborate facade they had all built together, ripping away the velvet curtains, to expose the ugly, bankrupt reality hiding underneath. The golden child was being publicly blamed for driving her husband to federal crimes. The wealthy patriarch was exposed as a broke failure leeching off his son-in-law. And the arrogant hedge fund manager was a sobbing, terminated criminal on his knees. The payoff was sweeter than I could have ever imagined, but the night was still far from over. Trey remained kneeling on the cold marble floor, completely broken. The grand foyer of the Athenaeum, just moments ago, a symbol of his impending triumph, had transformed into the exact site of his total destruction. The silence that gripped the room was absolute, shattered only by his ragged, gasping breaths. Amanda stood completely frozen on the grand staircase, her hands gripping the wooden banister so tightly, her knuckles were stark white. The color had entirely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost, trapped inside an incredibly expensive custom silk gown. She stared at Trey, then at Richard Dalton's retreating back, and finally, she looked up at me. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The money was gone. The status was gone. The country club memberships, the leased luxury cars, the endless shopping sprees to impress women she secretly hated. All of it had vanished into thin air the exact moment Richard fired her husband. She was no longer a wealthy socialite. She was the wife of an unemployed, disgraced criminal facing imminent federal charges. I stood on the landing above her, my expression completely neutral. I did not smile and I did not gloat. I did not need to. The total collapse of her fabricated reality was more satisfying than any insult I could have possibly delivered. Amanda's terrified gaze slowly morphed into a look of absolute unhinged fury. Her perfectly manicured facade cracked, revealing the deeply toxic, entitled child she had always been beneath the surface. She let out a guttural scream of pure rage, completely abandoning any remaining shred of social grace. "You ruined everything!" Amanda shrieked, the sound echoing harshly through the massive hall. She dropped her heavy designer clutch bag onto the stairs and lunged violently upward toward me. Her hands were outstretched, her perfectly painted nails aimed directly at my face like claws. She moved with a desperate, chaotic speed, fueled entirely by blind anger and the devastating loss of her fragile ego. I did not move an inch. I did not flinch. I did not step back, and I did not raise my hands to protect myself. I simply watched her come. Before Amanda could cover the short distance between us on the stairs, two massive figures stepped seamlessly out of the shadows from either side of the landing. They moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. My private security detail, dressed in immaculate dark suits, intercepted her completely mid-stride. One guard firmly grabbed her right arm, pulling it sharply behind her back, while the other secured her left arm in an unbreakable grip. They did not hurt her, but they instantly immobilized her, halting her chaotic lunge dead in its tracks. Amanda thrashed wildly against them, kicking her expensive heels against the wooden stairs and screaming incoherently. "Let me go, you animals!" she shrieked, her face contorted into an ugly mask of rage. "I am going to kill her! Let me go!" Down at the VIP table, Brenda finally snapped out of her paralyzed shock. She jumped out of her chair, knocking over a crystal water glass in her panic. She rushed toward the bottom of the grand staircase, her fake Chanel jacket flapping around her shoulders. "Sophie, tell them to stop!" Brenda screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. She pointed a frantic, trembling finger up at the guards holding Amanda. "Tell your thugs to let her go right now. She is your sister, for God's sake." I slowly descended one step, positioning myself just a few feet away from where Amanda was still struggling fruitlessly against the security detail. I looked down at my mother, whose face was flushed red with panic and anger. "She is not my sister, Brenda," I said, my voice carrying a cold, detached authority that echoed through the silent ballroom. "She is a massive liability." Brenda gasped, clutching a hand to her chest as if she had just been stabbed. "How can you say that? She is family. She is just upset. You provoked her. You humiliated her husband in front of everyone." "I humiliated him," I countered, arching an eyebrow. "Trey forged a corporate signature to steal $100,000, Brenda. He humiliated himself. He committed a federal crime. And your golden child just attempted a physical assault on a CEO in front of 200 wealthy witnesses, half of whom are likely on their phones texting their lawyers about this exact spectacle right now." Amanda stopped struggling for a brief second, breathing heavily, glaring at me with eyes full of poisonous hatred. "You planned this," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You knew about the contract. You knew the card was frozen. You set us up to fall." I looked directly into her eyes, leaning in just slightly. "I did not force Trey to steal Amanda. I did not force you to demand a platinum party you could not afford. I simply built a very expensive stage, and you two eagerly climbed right up and performed exactly as I expected. You hung yourselves. I just provided the rope." Thomas finally approached the bottom of the stairs, standing nervously next to Brenda. He looked incredibly small, his usual booming patriarch persona completely deflated. "Sophie, please." Thomas pleaded, his voice wavering with pathetic desperation. "This has gone far enough. Call off the guards. We can go into an office and talk about this quietly. We can figure out a way to fix this mess. We are a family." I looked at Thomas, feeling absolutely nothing for the man who had happily signed away my financial freedom for 5 years without a second thought. "There is nothing left to talk about quietly, Thomas," I stated firmly. "The time for quiet conversations ended 3 years ago, when you both stood by and let Brenda text me that I was a worthless embarrassment. The mess is entirely yours to clean up." I turned my attention back to the security guards holding Amanda. "Escort her down the stairs and out the front doors immediately," I ordered calmly. "If she resists or attempts to cause any further property damage, you have my full authorization to contact the Chicago Police Department and press formal charges for attempted assault." The guards nodded silently and began maneuvering a still thrashing, screaming Amanda down the grand mahogany staircase. She kicked and swore loudly, completely destroying whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left in front of the horrified financial elite. Trey finally pushed himself off the floor, his face pale and completely devoid of hope. He did not look at his wife as she was dragged past him. He simply stared blankly at the marble floor, his entire life in complete ruins. Brenda and Thomas watched in absolute horror as their golden child was physically removed from the building she had arrogantly tried to claim as her own just an hour earlier. The meltdown was complete, and the stage was finally clear. The only thing left to handle was the mass exodus of the guests who had just witnessed the most spectacular downfall in Chicago high society history. The silence in the Athenaeum was no longer shocked or captivated. It was the heavy, uncomfortable silence of people who had just stepped in something vile and wanted nothing more than to scrape it off their expensive shoes. The elite guests of Chicago high society did not linger to gossip. They did not stay for the 5-course tasting menu featuring Wagyu beef and white truffles. They simply wanted to leave. Richard Dalton was the first to move. He turned his back on my kneeling brother-in-law, buttoned his tailored suit jacket, and gave a sharp, silent nod to the other senior partners from his firm. Without a single backward glance, the entire executive team of the hedge fund marched firmly toward the coat check. That single movement broke the spell over the rest of the room. A mass exodus instantly began. The 200 wealthy clients, investors, and socialites placed their half-empty crystal champagne flutes onto the nearest cocktail tables and made a collective synchronized beeline for the exit. The string quartet, sensing the absolute death of the evening, quietly began packing their expensive instruments into velvet-lined cases. The catering staff stood frozen by the kitchen doors, holding silver trays of hot appetizers that absolutely no one would ever eat. Millions of dollars of net worth flowed out of the grand brass doors, leaving behind a profound, humiliating emptiness. Elias Maxwell stood near the center of the foyer, watching the crowd disperse with a look of calm understanding. He looked up at me standing on the landing of the grand staircase. He did not say a word, but he offered me a slow, deeply respectful nod of approval. I bowed my head slightly in return. He understood exactly what I had done and why it was entirely necessary. His private security detail quickly surrounded him, and the billionaire exited the building, taking with him the last remaining shred of legitimacy this anniversary gala ever possessed. Within 10 minutes, the massive ballroom was a complete ghost town. The thousands of imported white orchids cascading from the balconies suddenly looked incredibly foolish and wasteful, like expensive funeral flowers for a life that never really existed. Down below, Brenda and Thomas were completely isolated. They stood near their VIP table, looking around at the abandoned room in sheer panic. The people they had spent decades trying desperately to impress had just treated them like a highly contagious disease. Their social standing in Chicago was not just damaged, it was completely obliterated. Thomas, realizing that his golden son-in-law was fired and his favorite daughter was currently being thrown out onto the street, finally snapped out of his bewildered daze. He practically ran toward the staircase, his face sweating profusely, his expensive golf polo clinging to his chest. He gripped the wooden banister, looking up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. "Sophie, you have to fix this," Thomas pleaded, his voice cracking with desperate, pathetic urgency. "You have to go after Richard right now. Tell him it was a terrible misunderstanding. Tell him it was a joke, a family prank that just went a little too far. You own this building. He respects you. If you tell him to rehire Trey, he will listen to you." I stared down at my father, genuinely amazed by the sheer depth of his delusion. "A joke," I repeated coldly. "Forging a senior partner's signature to commit corporate fraud is not a family prank, Thomas. It is a federal offense. I cannot magically undo a felony just because you asked nicely." "You are family!" Thomas yelled, slamming his fist against the mahogany banister. "You owe us! We gave you everything! We are your flesh and blood! You cannot just stand there and watch us lose everything we have worked for. Trey is the only one who can pay the mortgage on the house. If he goes to prison, we are completely ruined. Your mother and I will be out on the street. You have to save us." I slowly descended the last few steps until I was standing face to face with the man who had always treated me like a financial stepping stone. "You lost the house the moment you handed me the deed as collateral for a party you could not afford," I said smoothly. "You bet your entire life on a man who was stealing to fund his massive ego. And you did it all while constantly reminding me that I was a worthless embarrassment. You do not get to play the family card now, Thomas. That card expired 3 years ago on Christmas Eve." Thomas opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He looked past me, his eyes widening in sudden fear as my private security detail returned from throwing Amanda out the front doors. The two massive guards flanked me silently, waiting for my command. I looked at Thomas, then over at Brenda, who was quietly sobbing by the cocktail table, and finally at Trey, who was still slumped on the floor staring blankly at the wall. The front doors of the Athenaeum are for paying clients and invited guests only. I announced, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. Since your deposit was fraudulent and your collateral is about to be formally seized, you are officially trespassing on my property. I turned to my head of security. Gather the three of them up. Do not let them leave through the grand foyer. Escort them through the kitchen corridors and take them down the back service elevator. Throw them out into the alley with the rest of the trash. Brenda shrieked in absolute horror as a security guard grabbed her firmly by the arm. Thomas tried to puff out his chest and resist, but a second guard sharply shoved him forward toward the swinging metal doors of the kitchen. A third guard hauled Trey off the floor by his collar, dragging the disgraced, sobbing hedge fund manager like a lifeless rag doll. They did not get to walk out under the glowing crystal chandeliers. They were forced through the greasy, dimly lit service corridors, passing the very catering staff they had treated like garbage all week. I stood alone in the grand foyer, listening to the heavy metal doors of the service elevator slam shut in the distance. The Athenaeum was finally quiet. The toxic infection that had plagued my entire life had been thoroughly and publicly excised, but I knew this was not the absolute end. Desperate people do incredibly stupid things when their survival is on the line. I knew they would be back the very next morning, crawling on their hands and knees, begging for mercy. And I was going to be sitting right in my office, ready to deliver the final fatal blow to their completely ruined empire. The morning sun was just beginning to break over the Chicago skyline, casting long, golden rays of light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my executive office. It was exactly 8 o'clock. I sat comfortably behind a massive polished mahogany desk on the top floor of the Athenaeum. The space was a breathtaking blend of historic architecture and modern luxury, featuring towering walls lined with rare first editions and a stunning abstract painting that commanded the room. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my perfectly brewed black coffee. The silence in the office was absolute perfection. I felt incredibly rested, having slept peacefully for the first time in my entire adult life. Then, exactly as I had anticipated, the sleek intercom unit on my desk buzzed with a sharp electronic chime. "Madam CEO." The voice of my head of security crackled through the speaker. "I apologize for the early disturbance. Your parents and your sister's family are currently standing in the main lobby. They are refusing to leave the premises. They look incredibly disheveled, and the man is practically hyperventilating. Should I have the local police remove them for trespassing?" I smiled, setting my coffee cup down onto a leather coaster. "No, David. That will not be necessary. Send them up to my office." 2 minutes later, the heavy frosted glass doors to my executive suite slid open silently. The visual contrast between the people who walked through those doors today and the arrogant socialites from the night before was absolutely staggering. Yesterday, they were draped in custom silk, expensive tailoring, and unearned superiority. Today, they looked like the Walking Dead. Amanda's perfectly styled blonde hair was a tangled, chaotic mess, scraped back into a messy knot. Her face was completely stripped of its heavy contouring and designer makeup, revealing deep, dark circles under her eyes. She was wearing wrinkled sweatpants and an oversized hoodie. Brenda looked like she had aged an entire decade overnight, clutching her leather purse tightly against her chest like a protective shield. Thomas dragged his feet across the plush Persian rug, his shoulders slumped entirely forward, his booming patriarch persona completely evaporated. And Trey looked like a man being led directly to the electric chair. His eyes were bloodshot and swollen. His skin had taken on a sickly grayish hue, and his hands trembled violently at his sides. They stepped into the center of the massive office, their eyes darting around the opulent space in sheer intimidation. They were standing inside the physical manifestation of the immense wealth they had spent their entire lives pretending to have. I did not offer them a seat. I did not stand up to greet them. I simply leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and watched them squirm. "You are all up incredibly early," I noted casually, my voice breaking the heavy silence of the room. "I would have thought you needed more sleep after such an eventful evening." Trey broke first. He could not maintain the facade for another second. He rushed forward, placing his trembling hands flat on the polished edge of my desk. He leaned in, his breath ragged and uneven. "Sophie, please," Trey croaked, his voice entirely devoid of the arrogant venom he had directed at me for years. "Richard's corporate attorneys called my cell phone at exactly 7 o'clock this morning. They gave me a final, non-negotiable ultimatum. If I do not wire exactly $100,000 into the firm's holding account by noon today, they are filing formal felony charges with the district attorney. The police will issue a warrant for my arrest by this afternoon." I looked at his shaking hands, feeling absolutely no pity. "That sounds like a very severe personal problem, Trey. You should probably use this time to call a bail bondsman instead of standing in my office." Amanda pushed past her husband, fresh tears streaming down her pale face. She slammed her hands down next to Trey's, her eyes wide with a manic, terrifying desperation. "Stop being so incredibly heartless." "Sophie," Amanda cried out, her voice cracking, "you cannot just sit there and let him go to jail. If he goes to federal prison, he loses his trading licenses forever. He will never work in finance again. We lose our entire income. We lose our cars, our country club, our entire life." She pointed a shaking finger around the lavish office, gesturing wildly at the expensive artwork and the towering bookshelves. "We all heard Elias Maxwell say, 'You sold your company for $45 million. Amanda shouted, her desperation making her bold. "Look around you. You own a historic building. You are incredibly rich now. What is $100,000 to you? It is absolutely nothing. It is pocket change. Just write the check and save my husband. You owe us that much for humiliating us last night." I stared at her, genuinely astounded by the sheer audacity of her logic. "$100,000 is exactly what it has always been, Amanda," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerously even tone. "It is a massive amount of money that you do not have. And it is money I certainly have no intention of setting on fire just to save a thief from facing the legal consequences of his own calculated crimes." Brenda stepped forward, trying a completely different tactic. The aggressive, threatening monster from the service corridor last night was suddenly replaced by a weeping, pathetic mother figure. "Sophie, sweetheart," Brenda sobbed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know we have made mistakes. I know I said terrible things to you, but we are begging you on our hands and knees. You proved your point last night. You won the war. You showed everyone in Chicago how brilliant and successful you are. Now please be the bigger person. Do not let your sister's life be completely destroyed over a stupid mistake." "A mistake is accidentally dropping a glass of water, Brenda," I corrected her sharply, refusing to let her minimize the severity of the situation. "Forging a senior partner's signature to actively embezzle corporate funds is a felony. And as for being the bigger person, that was the role you violently forced me to play for decades while you drained my bank accounts and treated me like dirt. I'm officially retiring from that position." Thomas cleared his throat nervously, stepping up beside Brenda. "You can consider it a loan, Sophie. A formal business loan with interest. Trey will sign whatever paperwork you want. He will pay you back every single penny. We will all guarantee it. Just wire the money to the firm before noon." I let out a short, cold laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Guarantee it with what, Thomas? You have absolutely no collateral. Your credit is completely garbage. Every single one of you is a terrible financial investment. Why on earth would I loan $100,000 to a family of proven liars?" Trey let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. "Because if you do not, my life is completely over," he begged, tears spilling openly down his cheeks. I looked him dead in the eye, resting my hands neatly on my desk. "Then I highly suggest you spend your last 4 hours of freedom packing a bag, Trey. Because I am not giving you a single dime." I leaned back in my heavy leather executive chair, the soft creak of the material the only sound in the massive room. I looked at the four of them standing before my desk. 3 years ago, these were the towering figures of authority and terror in my life. Now they were just pathetic, broken people begging for scraps. A genuine, unrestrained laugh bubbled up from my chest. It started small but quickly grew into a rich, echoing laugh that filled the entire office. It was not a laugh of hysteria, but of absolute, undeniable victory. Amanda recoiled as if I had slapped her. "What is so funny?" she demanded, her voice shaking. My husband is about to go to federal prison and you are sitting there laughing. I stopped laughing, resting my elbows on the polished mahogany. I find it incredibly funny, Amanda, I said, my voice dropping back to that icy professional calm. 3 years ago, Brenda sent a message to the entire family. She explicitly stated that I was a complete embarrassment because I chose to be a lowly teacher. She told me I was no longer her daughter. You all sat at that Christmas table drinking expensive wine and laughed while I walked out into the snow. You disowned me. So I am simply living up to your very own expectations. I am just a lowly nobody who does not have money for complete strangers. Brenda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Sophie, you do not mean that. We were angry. People say things they do not mean when they are angry. No, Brenda, you meant every single word, I replied sharply. You only regret it now because the person you threw away just happens to hold the winning lottery ticket. You do not love me. You love my bank account. And you are not getting a single penny of it. Trey stared at me, his bloodshot eyes wide. The finality in my voice finally pierced through his thick, desperate delusion. He realized I was not playing a game. I was not holding out for an apology. I was genuinely going to let him go to prison. The terror in his face instantly vanished, replaced by a dark, vicious, animalistic rage. He spun around, grabbing Amanda roughly by the shoulders and shoving her away from him. Get away from me, he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. You did this. You and your psychotic, blood-sucking family. Trey, stop it, Thomas bellowed, attempting to summon his old patriarchal authority. He stepped forward, raising a hand. Do not speak to my daughter that way. We are trying to fix this. Fix this, Trey screamed, turning his absolute fury onto Thomas. How are you going to fix this, Thomas? You are a complete fraud. You stand there acting like the king of the castle, but you are nothing but a broke, pathetic old man living on stolen time. Keep your voice down, Thomas hissed, his eyes darting nervously toward the frosted glass doors, terrified that my security guards might hear. Why should I? Trey roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Let everyone hear it. Let the great CEO Sophie hear exactly who she is dealing with. You want to talk about criminals, Thomas. You want to look down on me for forging a signature to pay for your daughter's party. You think I am the only one facing federal charges in this room. Brenda looked at Trey, completely confused. What are you talking about? Thomas is a respected real estate investor. Trey let out a maniacal, bitter laugh. Respected Brenda, your husband has not paid a single dime in federal income taxes in over 2 years. The air in the office was instantly sucked out of the room. Brenda froze, turning her head slowly to look at Thomas. The color drained from her face faster than it had at the gala. Thomas, she whispered, her voice trembling. Tell me he is lying. Thomas took a step back, his face flushing a violent, guilty shade of crimson. He opened his mouth, but he could not formulate a single word. He just stared at the floor, completely confirming Trey's accusation. Trey did not stop. He was a sinking ship, and he was determined to drag every single one of them down to the bottom of the ocean with him. He is not lying, Brenda. Why do you think he was constantly asking me for short-term loans? Why do you think he begged me to pay for your country club membership renewals? The IRS has been aggressively auditing him for 6 months. They found multiple hidden accounts, offshore tax shelters, and completely fabricated business expenses. The federal government is preparing to indict him for massive tax evasion. He is going to prison right alongside me, Amanda screamed, covering her ears. Shut up, Trey. Just shut up. No, I will not shut up, Trey shouted back, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. I ruined my entire life trying to prop up this pathetic family. I stole money from my firm because Thomas told me the IRS would seize his bank accounts if he did not pay a $50,000 penalty by last Friday. I gave him the cash to save his worthless skin, and that is exactly why I had to use the corporate card for the party. I sat behind my desk completely silent, taking another sip of my coffee. This was better than any theatrical performance I could have possibly orchestrated. The Golden family was violently tearing itself apart right in front of my eyes. You gave him $50,000 of our money, Amanda shrieked, lunging at Trey and hitting his chest with her fists. Are you insane? That was supposed to be for our vacation home in Aspen. It was not our money, Amanda, Trey yelled, catching her wrists and pushing her back. It was stolen money. And your father took it knowing exactly where it came from. Brenda turned her wrath onto Thomas, slapping him hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed loudly in the room. You lied to me, Brenda screamed, her face contorted in pure rage. You told me the business was thriving. You told me we were fine. You let me walk around Chicago high society pretending we were millionaires while the IRS was building a criminal case against you. You humiliated me. I was trying to protect you, Brenda. Thomas finally yelled back, rubbing his red cheek. You are the one who refuses to stop spending. You needed the new car. You needed the designer clothes. If I told you the truth, you would have left me. I should have left you 20 years ago. Brenda spat, her voice dripping with absolute venom. You are a complete failure. The screaming escalated into a deafening, chaotic roar. Amanda was sobbing uncontrollably, screaming at Trey for destroying her social life. Trey was screaming at Thomas for dragging him into a criminal conspiracy. Thomas was screaming at Brenda for being a gold-digging parasite. They hurled their darkest secrets, their deepest resentments, and their most toxic hatred directly at each other. The polished, perfect family from Fairfield had devolved into a pack of wild dogs fighting over a single bone. I simply watched them. I did not intervene. I did not ask them to quiet down. I sat in my luxurious leather chair, surrounded by the empire I had built entirely on my own, and let them destroy each other. For decades, they had united under one common goal, which was to make me feel small, worthless, and utterly dependent on their approval. But the moment the money ran out, their loyalty completely vanished. The absolute truth was finally laid bare. They did not actually love each other. They only loved what they could extract from each other. And now that the well was completely dry, they were violently tearing each other to pieces. Eventually, the screaming began to die down, as they simply ran out of breath. They stood in the center of my office chest, heaving faces red and streaked with tears, completely exhausted by their own venom. The silence slowly crept back into the room, heavy and suffocating. They slowly turned their attention back to me, realizing that their vicious infighting had not solved a single one of their catastrophic problems. They were still completely ruined, and I was still the only person in the room holding a lifeline. Brenda took a shaky step toward my desk, her eyes pleading. Sophie, please, she whispered, her voice completely broken. You have to help us. If the IRS comes after Thomas, if Trey goes to jail, we will lose everything. The bank will foreclose on the Colonial House. Where will we live? We will be out on the street. You have to save the house. I slowly set my coffee cup down and opened the heavy brass lock on my top desk drawer. The time for watching them fight was over. It was time to deliver the final, absolute crushing blow. I pulled a thick black leather binder from the top drawer and dropped it directly onto the center of my desk. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the quiet office. I looked directly at my mother, whose tear-streaked face was a portrait of absolute, unadulterated desperation. Save the house, I repeated, letting the words hang in the air for a brief, agonizing moment. Brenda, you are fundamentally misunderstanding the reality of your situation. You cannot save something that has already been completely destroyed. Actually, you already lost the house. Brenda blinked rapidly, her face twisting in profound confusion. What are you talking about? She stammered, gripping the edge of my mahogany desk to steady herself. The bank sent a warning letter, yes. But Thomas said he had an extension. He said we had time to figure it out. We just need to catch up on the payments. I flipped open the thick binder and slowly turned through the neatly organized pages of legal documents. I found the section I was looking for and slid the binder forward so they could all clearly see the glaring red stamps and official banking letterheads. Thomas lied to you, Brenda, I said evenly, my voice entirely devoid of sympathy. There was no extension. When Thomas came down to the Athenaeum earlier this week and arrogantly slapped the original deed to the Colonial House onto my desk to serve as collateral for Amanda's ridiculous party, he thought he was calling my bluff. He thought he was playing the role of the wealthy protective patriarch swooping in to save the day for his favorite daughter. I paused, shifting my gaze over to Thomas. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy frosted glass doors, as if calculating his chances of outrunning my private security guards. But what Thomas did not know, I continued, my voice sharp and unforgiving, was that the moment he handed me that physical deed and signed the collateral agreement, I immediately handed it over to my corporate legal team. I had them run a comprehensive title check and a full financial background sweep on the property. I needed to ensure the collateral was actually worth the $80,000 Trey still owed me for the platinum package. Amanda leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she tried to comprehend the complex financial web rapidly closing around them, and she demanded, her voice tight with panic. And my lawyers uncovered a massive, sprawling disaster, I explained calmly. Thomas has not made a single mortgage payment in over 6 months. He drained the equity line of credit completely dry to pay his mounting IRS penalties. The colonial house you love so much, Brenda. The house you proudly show off to your fake society friends to prove your status is completely underwater. The bank had already initiated formal foreclosure proceedings 3 weeks ago. Thomas hid the final notices from you. Brenda let out a high-pitched, horrifying gasp. She whipped her head around to look at Thomas. Her eyes were completely wild, filled with a toxic mixture of absolute betrayal and raw horror. Thomas, tell me she is lying, Brenda screamed, grabbing him violently by the collar of his wrinkled shirt. Tell me you did not let the bank take our home. Tell me you did not gamble away the only thing we have left to our name. Thomas could not even look his wife in the eye. He gently pushed her shaking hands away and stared pathetically at the floor. I was trying to secure a new private loan. He mumbled, his voice completely defeated. I was going to consolidate the debt. I just needed a little more time. If Trey had gotten that senior partner promotion, he was going to bail me out. We had an arrangement. Trey let out a loud, bitter laugh from the other side of the room. An arrangement, he mocked, pointing a shaking finger at his father-in-law. You extorted me, Thomas. You threatened to tell Amanda about my own offshore debts if I did not front you the cash. You are the exact reason I used the corporate card. You dragged me right down into the mud with you to save your own pathetic skin. Brenda stumbled backward, her hands covering her mouth. The colonial house was her absolute entire identity. It was the physical proof of her superiority over the rest of the world. The manicured lawns, the heated swimming pool, the expensive neighborhood. It was the only thing that gave her any value in Chicago high society. And now it was completely undeniably gone. So we are homeless. Amanda whispered, her voice completely hollow. She looked at Trey, then at her parents. The reality of her new destitute life, finally crushing her completely. We have absolutely nothing. You have exactly what you deserve, I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the desk. You built an entire empire on lies, stolen money, and toxic manipulation. You treated me like a financial workhorse for 5 years, bleeding me dry to maintain your ridiculous facade. And the second I stopped paying for your life, your entire world collapsed. Brenda began to hyperventilate. She leaned heavily against a leather guest chair, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. But the collateral, she gasped desperately, trying to find any possible loophole in the nightmare. If the house was already in foreclosure, then the deed is completely worthless. The bank owns it. That means you did not get your $80,000 for the party either, Sophie. You lost money too. Amanda's head snapped up. A tiny malicious spark of hope flared in her bloodshot eyes. For a brief second, she actually thought she had caught me in a massive financial mistake. She thought that even in their total destruction, they had somehow managed to drag me down with them. Yeah, Amanda sneered, wiping a tear from her cheek and trying to summon her old arrogance. You thought you were so incredibly smart taking that deed, but you just got scammed by your own father. The bank is going to auction it off to the highest bidder, and you are going to be left holding a worthless piece of paper. You are not as brilliant as you think you are, Madam CEO. I looked at my sister, watching her desperately cling to that tiny, pathetic shred of victory. It was almost sad how little she actually understood about the world of high finance. She thought she was playing checkers, completely unaware that I had already won the chess match weeks ago. I reached back into my drawer to pull out the final, devastating piece of paperwork. I pulled a single crisp sheet of heavy legal paper from the very bottom of my drawer. It was not a bank notice and it was not a warning letter. It was a finalized, notarized transfer of ownership. I placed it flat on the polished mahogany surface and slowly slid it across the desk toward Amanda, who was still wearing that pathetic, desperate smirk. "Read it," I commanded softly. Amanda snatched the paper, her eyes darting aggressively across the legal jargon. As she read, her smirk did not just fade, it violently shattered. Her hands began to tremble so severely that the heavy paper rattled in the quiet office. She dropped it back onto the desk, as if it had physically burned her fingers. "What does it say?" Thomas demanded, his voice cracking with panic. He leaned over, squinting at the bold black letters at the top of the page. I folded my hands neatly in front of me, watching the last remaining embers of their hope extinguish completely. "When my corporate lawyers discovered that your colonial house was in active foreclosure, I made a very quick, highly calculated phone call," I explained, keeping my voice incredibly even. "The bank was preparing to auction your property off for pennies on the dollar to clear their books of your toxic debt. But auctions take time, and banks prefer immediate liquidity." I paused, making sure every single one of them was hanging on my every word. "So I made them an offer they could not refuse," I continued. "I didn't just buy this library. Through my LLC, I bought the distressed debt on your mortgage from the bank. I paid off the exact amount you owed them in cash and transferred the deed." I looked directly into my father's horrified eyes. "I own your house, Thomas. Every single brick, every blade of grass and the front door you threw me out of 3 years ago, it belongs entirely to me." The realization hit Thomas with the force of a massive freight train. His knees instantly buckled. He stumbled backward, his arms flailing weakly before he collapsed heavily into one of the leather guest chairs. He looked completely hollowed out. His chest heaved, but he made no sound. The great real estate patriarch, the man who had constantly belittled my teaching salary, was now officially a squatter in a house owned by the daughter he had thrown away. He buried his face in his trembling hands, utterly defeated. Trey let out a low, breathless whistle, shaking his head in a mixture of pure shock and morbid awe. He was a finance guy. He knew a masterstroke when he saw one, even if it meant his own total destruction. He realized that this was a perfectly executed, entirely legal hostile takeover of their lives. But Brenda's reaction was entirely different and frankly deeply unsettling. For a moment, she stood completely still, staring at the notarized deed on my desk. Her brain, completely incapable of processing total failure, violently rebooted itself. The narcissistic delusion kicked into absolute overdrive. She looked at the paper, then looked up at me, and a wide, manic, completely terrifying smile spread across her face. "Oh, Sophie." Brenda gasped, her voice suddenly dripping with a sickeningly sweet, entirely fabricated warmth. She clapped her hands together, her eyes shining with fake delusional tears of joy. She rushed around the side of the heavy mahogany desk, her arms wide open, aiming directly for me. I remained perfectly still in my chair, staring at her with icy detachment as she reached down and tried to wrap her arms around my shoulders in a forceful, suffocating hug. "Thank God," Brenda cried out, squeezing my arms. "Thank God you bought it. Oh, my brilliant, wonderful daughter. You saved us. You kept the colonial house in the family. I knew you always loved that house. We can finally be a happy family living under your roof." She pulled back slightly, looking at me with wide, crazed eyes, completely ignoring the absolute revulsion radiating from my posture. "Do you not see what this means?" Brenda rambled, her voice climbing to a fever pitch of toxic optimism. "The bank cannot kick us out now, because you are the bank. We do not have to worry about the IRS taking the property because it is legally yours. You protected our assets. You can move into the master suite, and Thomas and I will take the guest rooms. We can redecorate the kitchen together. It will be absolutely perfect." Amanda stared at her mother, completely horrified by the psychotic pivot. "Mom, are you insane?" Amanda yelled. "She did not buy it to save us. She bought it to destroy us." Brenda spun around, glaring viciously at Amanda. "Shut your mouth, you ungrateful brat!" Brenda hissed, her maternal mask slipping for a fraction of a second before she turned back to me, the manic smile instantly returning. "She is just jealous, Sophie. She is just upset because Trey ruined everything for her. But you and me, we can fix this. You have always been the smart one. You have always been my special girl. I looked at the woman who had spent 33 years making me feel completely invisible. I looked at the hands that had typed the message, telling me I was a worthless embarrassment. She was actually trying to gaslight both of us into believing this was a beautiful family reunion. She was perfectly willing to throw Amanda and Trey completely under the bus if it meant she could continue living in her fancy house and pretending to be a wealthy socialite. I slowly raised my hands and firmly grasped Brenda's wrists. I peeled her fingers off my shoulders with deliberate, methodical force, pushing her completely away from me. I stood up from my leather chair towering over her, my expression hardening into absolute unyielding stone. "Do not ever touch me again," I warned, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet register that made Brenda physically recoil. Her fake smile finally faltered. "Sophie, sweetheart, I'm just saying we can be a family again." "We were never a family, Brenda," I stated coldly, walking around the desk to stand directly in front of her. "A family does not use their daughter as a human credit card. A family does not uninvite their child to Christmas dinner to impress a hedge fund manager. You do not love me. You love the fact that I currently hold the deed to the only thing you actually care about. You are looking at me right now and calculating exactly how many years you can live rent-free in my house while maintaining your pathetic fake country club lifestyle." I turned and looked at the four of them. Thomas defeated in the chair, Trey ruined on his feet, Amanda completely stripped of her golden child status, and Brenda desperately trying to manipulate a reality she could no longer control. "You seem to have a severe misunderstanding of how a change of ownership works," I announced, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum impact. "I did not buy that house to keep it in the family. I bought it so I could have the distinct, absolute pleasure of taking it away from you myself." Brenda's manic, desperate smile completely evaporated the exact second the words left my mouth. Her face went entirely slack, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. She looked exactly like a puppet whose strings had just been violently severed by a swift blade. "You misunderstand your position here, Brenda," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "I am not your savior. I am your landlord. And as the sole legal owner of the property, I am serving you with a formal, legally binding eviction notice. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises." Thomas let out a choked, wet wheeze from his chair. 30 days. Sophie, please be reasonable. We cannot pack up a 5-bedroom estate in 30 days. Where are we supposed to go? How are we supposed to afford movers when the IRS has frozen my accounts? "That is absolutely not my concern," I replied, crossing my arms over my chest and staring down at him. "You can move into a cramped apartment. You can rent a cheap motel room. You can pitch a tent in the woods for all I care. But on the 31st day, the locks will be changed, and anything left inside will be thrown directly into a commercial dumpster." Amanda was shaking her head violently, her tangled blonde hair whipping around her tear-stained face. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot just kick your own mother and father out onto the street. What are you going to do with a massive colonial house in the suburbs anyway? You live in a luxury downtown penthouse now. You own a historic library. You do not even want that house." "You are absolutely right, Amanda." I smiled, a genuine warm smile crossing my face for the very first time all morning. "I do not want the house. In fact, I find the entire structure completely repulsive. It is filled with decades of toxic memories, fake luxury, and emotional abuse. So I am not going to live in it. I already filed the commercial permits with the city zoning board last week. The week after you move out, I am bulldozing the entire colonial house to the ground." Brenda let out a blood-curdling shriek. She grabbed her chest, her knees giving out completely as she collapsed onto the plush Persian rug. "Bulldozing? No. You cannot destroy my home. My beautiful house. It is worth millions of dollars. It is my entire life." "It was worth millions," I corrected her smoothly, stepping out from behind my desk. "To me, the land is worth much more empty. Once the rubble is entirely cleared away, my educational foundation is going to build a state-of-the-art, completely free tutoring center for underprivileged kids on that exact lot." I am taking the ultimate symbol of your pathetic, greedy snobbery and turning it into a sanctuary for the exact type of lowly education you disowned me for pursuing. The pure poetry of the revenge finally sank into their minds. They had relentlessly mocked my teaching career, calling it a pathetic waste of time and an embarrassment to the family name. Now that very same teaching career had generated the millions required to literally crush their entire fabricated world into dust and replace it with a public school building. Thomas buried his face in his trembling hands and began to weep loudly. It was a pathetic broken sound, echoing in the opulent office. He had lost his business, his reputation, his freedom to the federal government, and now the physical roof over his head. Trey was still standing in the far corner, but his mind had completely checked out. He was staring blankly at the mahogany wall, mentally preparing himself for a decade inside a federal penitentiary. Amanda dropped heavily to her knees next to her mother. The golden child who had aggressively demanded white orchids and beluga caviar just 24 hours ago was now sitting on the floor in wrinkled sweatpants, completely homeless, married to a felon, and financially ruined beyond repair. I looked at the four of them huddled together on the floor of my magnificent executive suite. There was no more anger left in my body. There was no resentment, no bitterness, and absolutely no desire to scream. I just felt an overwhelming, incredible sense of profound emptiness regarding them. They were completely insignificant to me now. I reached over to my desk and pressed the silver intercom button. "David, please send the security detail into my office. This meeting is completely over." Within seconds, the heavy frosted glass doors slid open smoothly. 4 massive private security guards stepped into the room, their expressions completely stoic and strictly professional. "Escort these people out of the building," I instructed calmly, not even bothering to look down at my family anymore. "They are permanently banned from the Athenaeum. If they ever set foot on this property again, I want you to have them immediately arrested for criminal trespassing." The guards moved with swift, uncompromising efficiency. 2 of them hauled Thomas and Trey to their feet, marching the defeated, broken men out the door without a single word of protest. Trey did not fight back. He looked exactly like a ghost being led toward the afterlife. The other 2 guards reached down and grabbed Brenda and Amanda by their arms, hauling them roughly off the Persian rug. Brenda began to scream hysterically, kicking her feet and begging wildly for mercy. "Sophie, please, do not do this. I am your mother. I gave you life. You cannot destroy us like this." Brenda wailed, her voice echoing shrilly down the mahogany hallway as the guards dragged her backward out of the suite. Amanda was crying way too hard to speak, her face buried deep in her hands, her entire body shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs as she was pulled out the door right behind her mother. The heavy frosted glass doors slid shut with a satisfying click, instantly cutting off their hysterical screaming. The sound of their desperate cries faded rapidly down the hallway, entirely muffled by the thick, soundproof walls of my executive suite, until there was absolutely nothing left but the quiet, peaceful hum of the building's ventilation system. They were gone. The toxic infection that had plagued my entire existence had been thoroughly and permanently eradicated. I stood completely alone in the absolute silence of my massive, beautiful office. I walked slowly around my mahogany desk and stepped up to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The morning sun was now shining brilliantly over downtown Chicago, illuminating the towering glass skyscrapers and the bustling city streets far below. I picked up my coffee cup from the leather coaster. It was still perfectly warm. I took a slow, savoring sip, letting the rich, dark flavor wash over my tongue. I looked out at the vast, endless horizon, feeling a massive weight that I had carried for 33 years completely lift off my shoulders. I was no longer the family scapegoat. I was no longer the financial anchor for a family of greedy parasites. I was no longer the lowly teacher begging for a tiny scrap of validation from people who were entirely incapable of human love. I was Sophie. I was the sole founder of a multi-million-dollar technology empire. I was the proud owner of a historic educational institution. I was building a future that actually mattered, creating safe spaces where children could learn and grow without fear or judgment. I set my coffee cup down, walked over to my computer, and opened the architectural blueprints for the new free tutoring center. I had a lot of work to do today, and for the absolute first time in my life, I was entirely free, immensely wealthy, and utterly at peace.